creation rebellion, and the world before Abraham. Long before Jerusalem had walls, before Israel had kings, and before Moses stood before Pharaoh, the biblical story began with a world that was not broken. There was no exile, slavery, or ruined temple, only the voice of God speaking order into darkness. Yet the story that opens with life will eventually lead to a burned city and an empty throne. How did creation move toward exile? How did a world declared good become filled with violence, pride, and rebellion? And why, after judgment fell again and again, did the promise of God continue? To understand the Old Testament, we must begin where Scripture begins, not with Israel, but with creation itself. In the beginning, Genesis declares, God created the heavens and the earth. God speaks, and reality responds. Light separates from darkness. Waters are divided, dry land appears, vegetation rises. The heavens mark days and seasons. The seas, skies, and land fill with living creatures. What is formless receives structure, and what is empty becomes filled. Creation is the ordered work of one sovereign creator. Then the narrative slows. Humanity is created in the image of God. Male and female are given unique dignity and calling. They are told to be fruitful and fill the earth and exercise stewardship over the living world. Their authority is real but delegated. Blessing comes with responsibility. Gift comes with command. God plants a garden in Eden and places the man there to work it and keep it. Trees grow from the ground, beautiful and good for food. A river flows out from Eden. Eden is where humanity lives in the presence of God, surrounded by His provision and entrusted with sacred responsibility. At the center stand the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The man may eat from every tree except one. The command is simple and the warning is severe. The issue is not that knowledge itself is evil. The temptation is to seize moral independence, to define good and evil apart from the Creator. God forms the woman, and the two become one flesh. Before sin, there is no shame, domination, rivalry, or fear. Relationship with God, with one another, and with creation remains whole. But Eden's peace does not last. Genesis introduces the serpent as more crafty than the other creatures. He begins not with open denial, but with distortion. Did God actually say? The generosity of God is pushed aside, while the single prohibition becomes the center of attention. The serpent contradicts the warning of death and promises that eating will open their eyes and make them like God, knowing good and evil. The irony is profound. The man and woman already bear God's image, yet they are tempted to grasp through rebellion what they were meant to live through trust. The woman sees that the tree is good for food, pleasing to the eyes, and desirable for wisdom. She eats and gives some to her husband, who eats with her. The act is brief, but its consequences are not. Their eyes are opened, but their first discovery is shame. They cover themselves and hide when they hear God in the garden. The humans created to represent God now flee from Him. When confronted, the man blames the woman, and indirectly blames God for giving her to him. The woman blames the serpent. Sin has broken more than obedience. It has fractured trust, intimacy, courage, and responsibility. Judgment follows. The serpent is cursed. Conflict will mark the relationship between the serpent and the woman's offspring. Genesis speaks of a future descendant who will strike the serpent's head even as the serpent strikes his heel. It is a mysterious word of conflict and hope. Evil will wound, but it will not rule forever. Pain and disorder enter human relationships. The ground is cursed, and labor will be frustrated by thorns, sweat, and resistance. Human beings came from dust, and to dust they will return. Yet judgment is not the only thing present. God clothes the man and woman before sending them out of Eden. Cherubim and a flaming sword guard the way back to the tree of life. Exile begins here. Long before Israel is expelled from its land, humanity is expelled from the garden. The pattern that will shape much of the Old Testament has already appeared. God gives a place of blessing. Humanity violates the command connected to that place, judgment falls, and life outside the sacred place begins. But the story continues. Eve gives birth to Cain and Abel. Cain works the ground, Abel keeps flocks. Both bring offerings to God. The Lord regards Abel and his offering, but Cain responds to rejection with anger. God warns him that sin is crouching at the door and desires to master him. Cain is warned before violence occurs, but he does not master it. He rises against Abel in the field and kills him. The first death recorded after Eden is murder within a family. When God asks where Abel is, Cain answers, "Am I my brother's keeper?" But Abel's blood cries from the ground. Cain becomes a fugitive and wanderer. Even so, God places a mark on him to prevent immediate vengeance. Genesis never connects that mark with any race or skin color. Cain goes east of Eden and builds a city. His descendants develop livestock-keeping, music, and metalworking. Civilization advances, but moral progress does not keep pace. Lamech later boasts that he has killed a man for wounding him. Violence is no longer merely committed, it is celebrated. Another family line continues through Seth. The genealogy that follows may seem like a list of names, but its repeated rhythm carries a message. Generation after generation lives, has children, and dies. And he died. The warning of Eden is being fulfilled. One man interrupts the pattern. Enoch walks with God and is taken by God. Genesis gives few details, but his life offers a brief sign that fellowship with the Creator has not vanished entirely. Then comes Noah. By Noah's generation, the earth is filled with violence. Human thoughts and intentions are continually bent toward evil. The violence first seen in Cain has become the condition of the world. God announces judgment through a flood. Noah finds favor in the eyes of the Lord and is described as righteous in his generation. He is not sinless, but in a corrupt world he listens and builds the ark as commanded. Noah enters the ark with his family and representatives of the animals. Rain falls. The deep bursts open. Waters rise over the land. The flood is not a cheerful story about a boat and animals. It is creation unraveling under judgment. But God remembers Noah. A wind passes over the earth, the waters recede, and the ark comes to rest in the mountains of Ararat. At last, a dove returns with a fresh olive leaf. The world is emerging again. When Noah leaves the ark, he builds an altar. God establishes a covenant with Noah, his descendants, and every living creature. Never again will a flood destroy all flesh in the same way. The rainbow becomes the sign of that covenant. Humanity again receives the command to multiply and fill the earth. Human life remains sacred because people still bear the image of God. Sin has damaged that image but not erased it. Yet the flood has not removed sin from the human heart. Noah later becomes drunk and shame enters his family. The curse later spoken in Noah's family is directed toward Canaan, not toward every descendant of Ham, and it gives no support to claims of racial inferiority. Even the survivor of the flood cannot become the flawless new beginning humanity needs. The descendants of Noah spread into nations, lands, and languages. But on a plain in Shinar, humanity gathers again. The people build a city and a tower using baked bricks and bitumen. Their goal is not merely construction. They want to make a name for themselves and prevent their own scattering. The tower becomes a monument to human pride. The people are united, but their unity is organized around self-exaltation and resistance to God's command. God comes down to see the city, an intentional irony, because the tower seems enormous only to its builders. Their language is confused. communication breaks apart. The people scatter across the earth, and the city becomes known as Babel. Humanity wanted to make one great name. Instead, the nations are divided. Genesis has now established the crisis that will shape the Old Testament. Humanity has lost Eden. Brother has murdered brother. Violence has filled the earth. Pride has gathered the nations at Babel. Sin has survived every new beginning. Can any human family become a channel of blessing instead of another center of pride and violence? Genesis answers by narrowing its focus. From the nations, it traces one family line to Terah and his sons Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Haran dies, leaving a son named Lot. Abram marries Sarai. Then the text gives a detail that seems small beside the rise and fall of nations, yet it becomes central to everything that follows. Sarai is barren. She has no child. Terah takes Abram, Sarai, and Lot from Ur toward Canaan. They reach Haran and settle there. Terah dies, and the family's journey appears to stop before reaching its destination. Then God speaks. The Lord tells Abram to leave his country, his relatives, and his father's household, and go to a land that God will show him. The command requires movement away from everything familiar and toward what cannot yet be seen. But the command comes with a promise. God will make Abram into a great nation. He will bless him and make his name great, not through a tower built for human glory, but through divine purpose. Abram will become a blessing, and through him, all the families of the earth will be blessed. The story that began with all humanity now turns toward one man. A man with no land of his own, a man whose wife cannot bear children, a man being asked to walk toward a country he has never seen. At Babel, humanity tried to make its own name great. Now God promises to make Abram's name great. The nations gathered in fear of being scattered. Now Abram must leave security behind. The world has been divided by sin, violence, and pride. Now God begins a plan of blessing through a family that does not yet exist. Abram stands at the edge of the known world, carrying a promise that appears impossible. And when he leaves Haran, the history of Israel begins not with an army, a throne, or a nation, but with one act of trust. The Patriarchs. From Abraham to Joseph. Abram leaves Haran with Sarai, his nephew Lot, their possessions, and the people who have joined their household. He travels toward Canaan, carrying no map of the future, only the word of the God who called him. When Abram arrives near Shechem, the Lord appears to him and promises the land to his offspring. Abram builds an altar there. He moves south, builds another altar, and calls upon the name of the Lord. The promise has entered the land. But almost immediately it is tested. A famine strikes Canaan, forcing Abram to go down to Egypt. Afraid that the Egyptians will kill him to take Sarai, he asks her to say that she is his sister. The statement contains part of the truth, but Abram uses it to protect himself at Sarai's expense. Pharaoh takes Sarai into his household, and Abram receives livestock and servants. The man called to become a blessing has endangered his own wife and brought trouble upon a foreign household. God intervenes. Pharaoh discovers the deception, rebukes Abram, and sends him away with Sarai. The story does not hide the weakness of the man chosen by God. Abram has faith enough to leave his homeland, but not yet enough to face every danger without fear. He returns to Canaan and again calls upon the Lord. As Abram and Lot grow wealthy, their herds become too large for the land to support them together. Their herdsmen quarrel. Abram allows Lot to choose where he will settle. Lot looks toward the Jordan Valley, sees fertile land, and chooses the region near Sodom. The land appears like a garden, but the cities within it are known for great wickedness. Abram remains in Canaan. After Lot departs, God tells Abram to look in every direction. All the land he sees will one day belong to his descendants. His offspring will become as numerous as the dust of the earth. Yet Abram still has no son. Political conflict soon reaches the land. A coalition of eastern kings defeats the rulers of Sodom and the surrounding cities. Lot is taken captive along with his possessions. Abram gathers trained men from his household, pursues the invading army, and rescues Lot. On his return, he meets Melchizedek, king of Salem and priest of God Most High. Melchizedek blesses Abram and praises God for delivering his enemies into his hand. Abram gives him 1/10 of the recovered goods. The king of Sodom then offers Abram the possessions taken in battle, but Abram refuses to enrich himself through Sodom. He will not allow that king to claim responsibility for making him wealthy. Abram has won a military victory, but his deeper problem remains unresolved. What good are land, livestock, and victory if he has no heir? God speaks to him in a vision. "Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great." Abram answers honestly. He points out that he remains childless and that a servant may inherit his household. God tells him that his own son will be his heir. Then God brings him outside. "Look toward heaven and number the stars if you are able to number them. So shall his descendants be." Abram believes the Lord, and his faith is counted to him as righteousness. But believing the promise does not mean understanding how it will be fulfilled. God confirms his covenant through an ancient ceremony. Animals are divided, and in the darkness a smoking firepot and a flaming torch pass between the pieces. God binds himself to the promise. Abram's descendants will possess the land, but not immediately. They will first live as strangers in another country, where they will be oppressed for generations before God brings them out. Long before Joseph enters Egypt or Moses confronts Pharaoh, the coming exile and deliverance are already within the covenant story. Yet Sarai continues to wait. In the ancient world, barrenness carried deep sorrow and social vulnerability. After years without a child, Sarai gives her Egyptian servant Hagar to Abram, hoping to build a family through her. Hagar conceives, and conflict enters the household. Sarai feels despised. Abram refuses to take responsibility for resolving the tension, and Sarai treats Hagar harshly. Hagar flees into the wilderness. There beside a spring, the angel of the Lord finds her. Hagar is a servant, a foreigner, and a woman fleeing abuse, yet she is seen by God. She is told to return, and she receives a promise that her descendants will be numerous. Her son will be named Ishmael, meaning that God hears, because the Lord has heard her suffering. Hagar responds by naming the Lord as the God who sees her. Ishmael is born when Abram is 86 years old. 13 more years pass. Then God appears again and changes the names at the center of the covenant. Abram becomes Abraham, father of a multitude. Sarai becomes Sarah, a princess who will become the mother of nations. God establishes circumcision as the covenant sign for Abraham's household. Every male is to bear in his body a mark of belonging to the covenant. Abraham is told that Sarah herself will bear the promised son. He laughs. The idea seems impossible. Abraham is nearly 100, and Sarah is far beyond the age of childbearing. Abraham asks whether Ishmael might live under the promise instead. God promises to bless Ishmael and make him fruitful, but the covenant line will continue through a son born to Sarah. His name will be Isaac, a name connected with laughter. Soon afterward, Abraham receives 3 visitors near the oaks of Mamre. He offers them generous hospitality. During the meal, one of the visitors declares that Sarah will have a son within the appointed time. Sarah listens from the tent and laughs silently. She looks at her age and Abraham's age, and the promise appears beyond possibility. The Lord asks, "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" That question stands over the entire patriarchal story. Before Isaac is born, the narrative returns to Sodom. The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great. Abraham pleads for the cities, asking whether the judge of all the earth will destroy the righteous with the wicked. He begins with 50 righteous people, then continues until the number reaches 10. The cities cannot produce even that small community of righteousness. 2 angels enter Sodom, where Lot insists that they stay in his house. That night, the men of the city surround the home and demand access to the visitors. The scene reveals a society shaped by violence, domination, and contempt for the vulnerable. The angels strike the attackers with blindness and urge Lot's family to flee. Lot hesitates, and the messengers take him, his wife, and his daughters by the hand. Fire and destruction fall upon the plain. Lot's wife looks back and becomes a pillar of salt. The narrative gives no long explanation for her action, but it portrays a final attachment to the city they were commanded to leave. Lot survives, yet his family's story ends in shame and confusion. His daughters later bear sons who become ancestors of Moab and Ammon peoples, who will have a long and complicated relationship with Israel. Even rescue does not erase every consequence of living too close to corruption. Then at the time God promised, Sarah gives birth. The impossible child arrives. Abraham names him Isaac, and Sarah says that God has brought her laughter. Everyone who hears will laugh with her. But Isaac's birth also intensifies tension with Hagar and Ishmael. Sarah sees Ishmael mocking or playing in a way she finds threatening, and demands that Abraham send Hagar and her son away. Abraham is distressed. Ishmael is his son. God tells him to listen to Sarah concerning the covenant line, while also promising to make a nation from Ishmael. Hagar and Ishmael wander in the wilderness until their water is gone. Hagar places the boy under a bush and sits at a distance, unable to watch him die. But God hears the boy. An angel calls to Hagar, and God opens her eyes to a well. Ishmael survives, grows in the wilderness, becomes an archer, and later fathers a people of his own. The covenant line passes through Isaac, but the God of the covenant has not ignored Ishmael. Then comes Abraham's greatest test. God tells him to take Isaac, the son he loves, and go to the land of Moriah. There, Abraham is to offer him as a burnt offering. The command confronts everything Abraham has been promised. Isaac is not merely Abraham's beloved child. He is the son through whom the covenant is supposed to continue. Abraham rises early, prepares the wood, and begins the journey. For 3 days, father and son traveled toward the appointed mountain. Isaac carries the wood, while Abraham carries the fire and the knife. Isaac asks the question Abraham cannot easily answer. "My father, behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" Abraham replies, "God will provide for himself the lamb." On the mountain, Abraham builds the altar, arranges the wood, and binds Isaac. As he reaches for the knife, the angel of the Lord calls his name, "Abraham, Abraham." He is told not to harm the boy. His fear of God has been demonstrated. Abraham looks up and sees a ram caught by its horns in a thicket. The ram is offered in Isaac's place. Abraham names the place, "The Lord will provide." The promise survives not because Abraham controls its future, but because God provides. Sarah later dies at Hebron. Abraham purchases the cave of Machpelah as a burial site. The transaction is important. Although Abraham has been promised the land, the first piece of Canaan he legally possesses is a tomb. He is still a foreigner, waiting for fulfillment. Abraham then sends his servant to find a wife for Isaac from among his relatives, rather than from the surrounding Canaanites. The servant prays for guidance and meets Rebekah at a well. Her generosity extends beyond offering him water. She draws water for his camels as well, a task requiring significant effort. The servant recognizes the answer to his prayer and explains Abraham's household and the purpose of his journey. Rebekah agrees to leave her family. Like Abraham before her, she travels toward an unknown future on the strength of a promise. She becomes Isaac's wife, and he is comforted after his mother's death. Abraham dies at an old age and is buried by Isaac and Ishmael together. The moment is brief, but it brings the two sons back to the same tomb. The story now turns to Isaac and Rebekah. Once again, the covenant family faces barrenness. Isaac prays, and Rebekah conceives twins. The children struggle within her, and she asks why this is happening. God tells her that two nations are in her womb, and that the older will serve the younger. Esau is born first, red and covered with hair. Jacob follows, grasping Esau's heel. The struggle begins before either brother can speak. Esau grows into a skilled hunter and becomes Isaac's favorite. Jacob remains closer to the tents and is favored by Rebekah. One day, Esau returns exhausted from the field and asks for Jacob's stew. Jacob demands the birthright in exchange. Esau swears it away for bread and lentils. The birthright represented family leadership and inheritance. Esau treats it as less valuable than immediate hunger. Jacob values it, but seeks it through manipulation. Years later, when Isaac is old and nearly blind, he prepares to bless Esau. Rebekah overhears the plan and tells Jacob to impersonate his brother. Jacob hesitates, not because deception is wrong, but because he fears being discovered. He wears Esau's clothes and covers his arms and neck with goat skins. Isaac recognizes Jacob's voice, but feels what seems to be Esau's hands. Deceived, he gives Jacob the blessing intended for the firstborn. When Esau returns, the truth is exposed. Isaac trembles. Esau cries out bitterly and begs for another blessing. His grief turns to hatred, and he plans to kill Jacob after their father dies. The family that carries the promise is divided by favoritism, appetite manipulation, and deception. Rebekah sends Jacob away to her brother Laban in Haran. Jacob leaves Canaan alone. On the journey, he sleeps with a stone beneath his head. In a dream, he sees a stairway or ramp extending between earth and heaven, with angels ascending and descending. The Lord stands above it and repeats the promises given to Abraham, land, descendants, and blessing for all families of the earth. Jacob has obtained the blessing through deception, but he cannot manufacture the covenant. God gives the promise by grace. Jacob names the place Bethel, house of God. He then continues to Haran, where he meets Rachel, Laban's daughter. Jacob loves Rachel and agrees to work 7 years to marry her. The years seem brief because of his love, but on the wedding night, Laban deceives him and gives him Leah instead. The deceiver has met a greater deceiver. Jacob must work another 7 years for Rachel. A painful rivalry develops between the two sisters. Leah is unloved, but bears children. Rachel is loved, but barren. Through Leah, Rachel, and their servants Bilhah and Zilpah, Jacob becomes the father of sons, who will become the ancestors of Israel's tribes. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, and eventually Joseph are born. A daughter, Dinah, is also named. The family grows, but peace does not grow with it. Jacob also becomes wealthy through years of conflict and negotiation with Laban. At last, God tells him to return to the land of his fathers. Jacob leaves secretly with his wives, children, servants, and livestock. Laban pursues him, but the confrontation ends with a covenant marking the boundary between them. Now Jacob must face the threat he has avoided for years. Esau is coming with 400 men. Jacob is terrified. He divides his people and possessions into groups, sends gifts ahead, and prays to the God of Abraham and Isaac. He admits that he is unworthy of the faithfulness shown to him and asks for deliverance. That night, Jacob remains alone. A man wrestles with him until daybreak. When the man sees that Jacob will not release him, he strikes Jacob's hip. Still, Jacob holds on and demands a blessing. The man asks his name, Jacob. It is more than identification. Jacob's name carries the memory of grasping, struggling, and maneuvering. The man gives him a new name, Israel, because he has struggled with God and with men and has prevailed. Jacob leaves the encounter limping. He has spent his life gaining advantage through strength and deception. Now he receives blessing while wounded and unable to control the one who gives it. At sunrise, he meets Esau. Jacob boasted repeatedly, expecting anger. Instead, Esau runs to him, embraces him, and weeps. The feared revenge does not come. Yet reconciliation between the brothers does not remove all danger from Jacob's household. At Shechem, Dinah is violated by the son of a local ruler. Her brothers Simeon and Levi respond with deception and massacre, killing the men of the city after persuading them to be circumcised. Jacob condemns their actions because they have placed the entire household at risk. The sons have answered injustice with uncontrolled vengeance. The family continues toward Bethel, where Jacob buries the foreign gods found among his household and renews his commitment to the God who met him when he was fleeing. Rachel later dies while giving birth to Benjamin. Jacob buries her on the road to Bethlehem. Isaac eventually dies, and Jacob and Esau bury him together. The narrative now centers on Jacob's sons, especially Joseph. Joseph is 17 and clearly favored by his father. Jacob gives him a special robe, marking him with distinction before his brothers. Joseph reports badly on some of them. Then he shares dreams in which his brothers' sheaves bow to his sheaf, and the sun, moon, and 11 stars bow before him. His brothers hate him, and even Jacob rebukes him. One day Jacob sends Joseph to check on his brothers as they tend the flocks. They see him approaching and decide to kill the dreamer. Reuben persuades them not to shed blood directly, intending to rescue Joseph later. They strip off his robe and throw him into an empty pit. Then, while eating, they see a caravan traveling toward Egypt. Judah proposes selling Joseph rather than killing him. Joseph is pulled from the pit and sold for silver. He is carried south toward Egypt, while his brothers stain the robe with goat's blood. They show it to Jacob without openly stating what happened. Jacob recognizes the robe and concludes that a wild animal has killed his son. He tears his garments and refuses comfort. The brothers have removed Joseph from their sight, but they cannot remove the consequences of their act. In Egypt, Joseph is sold to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh. The Lord is with Joseph, and his work prospers. Potiphar places him over the household, but Potiphar's wife repeatedly attempts to seduce him. Joseph refuses, explaining that such an act would betray his master and be a sin against God. One day she grabs his garment. Joseph flees, leaving it in her hand. She uses the garment as false evidence, accusing him of assault. For the second time, clothing is used to create a lie about Joseph. He is sent to prison. Yet even there, the Lord is with him. The prison keeper places Joseph in responsibility over the other prisoners. Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker are later imprisoned, and each has a troubling dream. Joseph tells them that interpretations belong to God and explains their dreams. The cupbearer will be restored. The baker will be executed. The interpretations come true. Joseph asks the cupbearer to remember him before Pharaoh, but once restored, the man forgets him. 2 full years pass. Then Pharaoh dreams of 7 healthy cows devoured by 7 thin cows. He dreams again of 7 full heads of grain swallowed by 7 thin and scorched heads. Egypt's wise men cannot interpret the dreams. At last, the cupbearer remembers Joseph. Joseph is brought quickly from prison, shaved, given clean clothing, and placed before Pharaoh. He makes clear that the interpretation does not come from his own power. God has revealed what he is about to do. 7 years of abundance will come, followed by 7 years of severe famine. Joseph advises Pharaoh to appoint a wise administrator to collect grain during the years of plenty. Pharaoh recognizes wisdom in Joseph and elevates him over Egypt, second only to the throne. The slave becomes governor. The prisoner holds Pharaoh's signet ring. The brother sold for silver now controls the grain that will preserve nations. During the years of abundance, Joseph stores vast quantities of food. He marries Asenath and has 2 sons. He names the first Manasseh, because God has helped him move beyond his suffering. He names the second Ephraim, because God has made him fruitful in the land of his affliction. Then the famine begins. It reaches beyond Egypt into Canaan, where Jacob and his sons face hunger. Hearing that Egypt has grain, Jacob sends 10 sons south. Benjamin remains behind because Jacob fears losing Rachel's only remaining son. The brothers arrive before Egypt's governor and bow with their faces to the ground. They do not recognize Joseph, but Joseph recognizes them. The dreams of his youth stand before him not as a simple moment of triumph, but as a test. Have the brothers changed? Can the family that betrayed him be preserved without ignoring what they did? Joseph speaks harshly and accuses them of spying. He keeps Simeon and demands that they return with Benjamin to prove their honesty. On the journey home, the brothers discover that their money has been returned in their sacks. Fear grows. They begin to connect their present trouble with the day they ignored Joseph's cries from the pit. The famine becomes severe, and the family's grain runs out. Judah promises to take responsibility for Benjamin, and Jacob finally allows him to go. When the brothers return to Egypt, Joseph sees Benjamin. He struggles to control his emotion and leaves the room to weep. He prepares a feast for them, seating them in order from oldest to youngest. Benjamin receives a portion far larger than the others. Then Joseph arranges a final test. His silver cup is placed in Benjamin's sack. After the brothers leave, they are overtaken and accused of theft. The cup is found with Benjamin. The brothers return and fall before Joseph. Joseph announces that Benjamin must remain as his servant while the others go free. Years earlier, the brothers sacrificed one favored son to protect themselves. Now they are given the opportunity to abandon another favored son. Judah steps forward. He explains their father's grief and the bond between Jacob and Benjamin. He describes how losing Benjamin would bring the old man down to the grave in sorrow. Then Judah offers himself in Benjamin's place. The brother who once proposed selling Joseph now offers to become a slave to save Joseph's younger brother. The family has not become perfect, but something has changed. Joseph can no longer restrain himself. He orders the Egyptian attendants to leave and weeps so loudly that Pharaoh's household hears. He reveals his identity. "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" The brothers are terrified. The man they sold now possesses the authority to punish them. But Joseph tells them not to be consumed by fear. They intended evil against him, but God used what happened to preserve life. Joseph does not call their betrayal good. He does not pretend the suffering was unreal. He distinguishes human intention from divine providence. Their act was evil, yet God was able to carry his purpose through it. Joseph embraces Benjamin and then his other brothers. Pharaoh invites the entire family to settle in Egypt. Wagons are sent north along with provisions. When the brothers tell Jacob that Joseph is alive and rules over Egypt, he cannot believe them. Then he sees the wagons. His spirit revives. Israel gathers his household and begins the journey south. At Beersheba, God speaks to him in a vision. "Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for there I will make you into a great nation." The family that entered Canaan with Abraham now leaves it under the protection of Joseph. Jacob arrives in Egypt and embraces the son he believed was dead. Pharaoh allows the family to settle in Goshen, a region suitable for their livestock. There, the household of Israel survives the famine and begins to multiply. Before Jacob dies, he blesses Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, giving the younger Ephraim the greater blessing. Once again, the expected order is reversed. Jacob then gathers his sons and speaks over their futures. Reuben loses preeminence. Simeon and Levi are condemned for violence. Judah receives words of leadership. The scepter will not depart from his line. The path toward Israel's future kings has begun. Jacob dies and is carried back to Canaan, where his sons bury him in the cave of Machpelah beside Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Rebekah, and Leah. After the funeral, Joseph's brothers fear that he has only delayed revenge until their father's death. They send a message asking forgiveness and offer themselves as servants. Joseph weeps. He again tells them that they intended evil, but God intended the outcome for good, to preserve many lives. He promises to care for them and their children. Joseph lives to see later generations of his family. Before his death, he reminds them that Egypt is not their final home. God will visit them and bring them up to the land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He makes them swear to carry his bones with them when that day comes. Then Joseph dies at the age of 110. His body is embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt. Genesis ends with a coffin. The family has been preserved, but the promise has not yet been completed. They possess no nation, no kingdom, and almost none of the land promised to their ancestors. They are living under the protection of Egypt, waiting for a future visitation from God. For now, Egypt is a place of rescue, but generations will pass. Joseph's name will fade from the memory of power. A new Pharaoh will look at the growing people of Israel and see not a family to protect, but a threat to control. The land that saved them will become the house of their slavery. Slavery, Exodus, and the covenant at Sinai. Joseph's coffin rested in Egypt as a silent reminder that the land of survival was not the land of promise. The descendants of Jacob remained in Goshen, and over the generations they multiplied. What had entered Egypt as one extended family became a people large enough to attract the attention of the throne. Then a new king arose who did not know Joseph. Whether this means that Joseph's service had been forgotten or that a new political order no longer felt bound by the past, the result was the same. Pharaoh looked upon the Israelites and saw danger. They were too numerous. If war came, he feared they might join Egypt's enemies, fight against the kingdom, and escape from the land. The people preserved by Joseph were now treated as a threat to national security. Fear became policy. Pharaoh placed taskmasters over the Israelites and forced them into hard labor. They built storage cities for Egypt. Their lives became bitter with work in mortar, brick, and the fields. But oppression did not produce the result Pharaoh intended. The more the Israelites were afflicted, the more they multiplied. Egypt's fear deepened. Pharaoh then ordered the Hebrew midwives Shiphrah and Puah to kill the newborn boys while allowing the girls to live. The midwives feared God more than the king and refused. When questioned, they answered that the Hebrew women gave birth before the midwives arrived. The empire commanded death, but 2 women quietly resisted. Pharaoh then made the order public. Every Hebrew son was to be thrown into the Nile. The river that sustained Egypt became an instrument of terror. During this time, a man and woman from the tribe of Levi had a son. The child's mother hid him for 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she placed him in a small basket coated with bitumen and pitch, and set it among the reeds beside the Nile. The Hebrew word used for this basket is also connected to the vessel of Noah. Once again, a life is preserved through water in a carefully prepared ark. The child's sister watches from a distance. Pharaoh's daughter comes to the river and discovers the basket. When she opens it, the infant is crying. She recognizes him as one of the Hebrew children. She knows the command of her father, yet she chooses compassion. The child's sister approaches and offers to find a Hebrew woman to nurse him. In a quiet reversal, the boy's own mother is paid to care for the child Pharaoh intended to destroy. When he grows older, he is brought into the household of Pharaoh's daughter. She names him Moses because she drew him out of the water. The deliverer of Israel is raised inside the palace of the king who enslaves Israel. Moses grows up between two worlds. He belongs by birth to the Hebrews, but has been raised within Egyptian royalty. Scripture does not describe every detail of his education or early life, but it is clear that he knows the suffering of his people. One day, he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. Moses looks around, strikes the Egyptian, and hides the body in the sand. His anger is directed against injustice, but his action is violent and secretive. He attempts to deliver one man through his own strength, yet he has no authority to free the nation. The next day, he sees two Hebrews fighting and confronts the man at fault. "Who made you a ruler and a judge over us?" the man asks. "Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Moses realizes that his act is known. Pharaoh seeks to kill him, and Moses flees eastward into Midian. The prince becomes a fugitive. Far from Egypt, Moses sits beside a well. When shepherds drive away the daughters of a Midianite priest, Moses defends the women and waters their flock. He is welcomed into the household and later marries Zipporah. She gives birth to a son, Gershom. Moses names him with a word reflecting his condition. He has become a stranger in a foreign land. Years pass. The young man who once acted quickly grows old in the wilderness tending the flock of his father-in-law. Egypt continues without him. The Israelites remain under bondage, but their cries rise to God. The text says that God hears their groaning. He remembers his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This does not mean that God had forgotten and suddenly recalled it. It means that he is about to act in faithfulness to what he promised. Near Horeb, the mountain of God, Moses sees a bush burning without being consumed. He turns aside to investigate. God calls to him from the fire. "Moses, Moses." Moses answers, "Here I am." He is told to remove his sandals because he is standing on holy ground. The God speaking to him identifies himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The promise given to the patriarchs has reached the moment of intervention. God declares that he has seen the affliction of his people, heard their cries, and knows their suffering. He has come down to deliver them from Egypt and bring them into a good and spacious land. Then Moses hears the command that changes the rest of his life. "Come, I will send you to Pharaoh." Moses asks, "Who am I?" Once he acted as though he could rescue Israel by force. Now, after years in exile, he feels incapable of confronting Egypt. God does not answer by praising Moses' hidden potential. He says, "I will be with you." The success of the mission will not rest on Moses' importance, but on the presence of the one sending him. Moses asks what name he should give. When the Israelites ask which God has sent him, God replies, "I am who I am." The divine name revealed to Moses is connected with God's eternal self-existent being and his faithful presence. He is not one local deity among many. He is the God of the fathers, the one who is and who will be with his people. Moses continues to object. What if the people do not believe him? God gives him signs. His staff becomes a serpent and then a staff again. His hand becomes diseased and is restored. Water from the Nile will become blood when poured upon the ground. Moses then protests that he is not eloquent. God reminds him that the human mouth is under divine authority. Still, Moses pleads for someone else to be sent. The Lord becomes angry, but he provides Aaron, Moses' brother, to speak with him. Moses returns toward Egypt, carrying the staff that will become a sign of God's power. Aaron meets him, and together they gather the elders of Israel. The people believe. When they hear that God has seen their suffering, they bow down and worship. Then Moses and Aaron stand before Pharaoh. They deliver the command of the Lord, the God of Israel, "Let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness." Pharaoh answers with contempt, "Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice and let Israel go?" That question becomes the central conflict of the Exodus. Pharaoh considers himself the supreme power in the land. He controls labor, life, and death. He does not recognize the authority of Israel's God. Instead of releasing the people, he increases their burden. The Israelites must continue producing the same number of bricks, but Egypt will no longer provide the straw. They must gather it themselves while meeting the previous quota. The Hebrew foremen are beaten when the work falls behind. They confront Moses and Aaron, accusing them of making Israel hateful in Pharaoh's sight. The first result of Moses' obedience is not freedom. It is greater suffering. Moses returns to God in anguish. Why has the mission made things worse? Why has deliverance not come? God answers by restating his covenant. He will bring Israel out, rescue them from slavery, redeem them with great acts of judgment, take them as his people, and bring them into the land promised to their ancestors. The Israelites cannot receive the promise because of their broken spirit and cruel bondage. Then the confrontation begins. Moses and Aaron return before Pharaoh. Aaron throws down his staff, and it becomes a serpent. Egypt's magicians produce a similar sign through their secret arts, but Aaron's staff swallows theirs. The sign warns Pharaoh that Egypt's power will not stand equal to the authority of God. Still, Pharaoh's heart remains hard. Moses meets him beside the Nile. The river is struck, and its water turns to blood. Fish die, the river stinks, and the Egyptians cannot drink from it. The Nile was the source of Egypt's agricultural wealth and a symbol of life. It had also carried the bodies of Hebrew children. Now its waters become a sign of judgment. The Egyptian magicians imitate the sign, and Pharaoh refuses to listen. Frogs then cover the land. They enter houses, bedrooms, ovens, and kneading bowls. Pharaoh asks Moses to pray for their removal and promises to release the people. But when relief comes, Pharaoh hardens his heart. Dust becomes gnats, or small biting insects. The magicians cannot reproduce the sign and warn Pharaoh this is the finger of God. He still refuses. Swarms invade Egyptian territory, while the region where the Israelites live is protected. A distinction is becoming visible. The judgments are not random disasters. They reveal that the God of Israel can separate his people from the land around them. A severe plague strikes Egyptian livestock. Boils break out on people and animals. Even the magicians cannot stand before Moses. Hail then falls with destructive force. Thunder, fire, and ice strike crops, servants, and animals left in the fields. Yet a warning is given beforehand, and some of Pharaoh's officials fear the word of the Lord enough to bring their servants and livestock under shelter. The judgments reveal not only power, but also the opportunity to respond. Pharaoh confesses that he has sinned and asks for the storm to stop, but once the sky clears, he refuses again. Locusts consume what the hail has left. Pharaoh's own officials urge him to let the Israelites go, asking whether he understands that Egypt is being ruined. Still, he attempts to negotiate. Perhaps only the men may leave. Moses refuses. The entire people must go. Darkness then covers Egypt for 3 days, a darkness so oppressive that people do not move from their places. Yet the Israelites have light where they live. Egypt's sun, one of its most powerful religious symbols, cannot overcome the darkness commanded by the God of Israel. Pharaoh offers another compromise. The Israelites may leave, but their livestock must remain. Moses again refuses. Pharaoh orders him to leave and warns that if Moses appears again, he will die. Moses answers that he will not see Pharaoh's face again. One final judgment remains. God announces that every firstborn in Egypt will die, from the household of Pharaoh to the lowest servant, along with the firstborn of the livestock. The coming judgment reaches the structure of inheritance and power itself. But Israel is given instructions for protection. Each household is to select an unblemished lamb. At the appointed time, the lamb is killed and its blood is placed upon the doorposts and lintel of the house. The family eats the meal dressed for departure with sandals on their feet and staff in hand. They eat unleavened bread because there will be no time to wait for dough to rise. This meal becomes Passover. The blood is a sign. When judgment passes through the land, the marked households are spared. The protection does not come because the Israelites are naturally superior to the Egyptians. They too must trust the word of God and shelter beneath the sign he provides. At midnight, a cry rises throughout Egypt. From the palace to the prison, death enters the houses without protection. Pharaoh's own firstborn dies. Pharaoh summons Moses and Aaron during the night and commands the Israelites to leave. The Egyptians urge them to depart quickly, fearing that otherwise the entire nation will die. The Israelites leave, carrying silver, gold, clothing, kneading bowls, and unleavened dough. After generations of forced labor, they walk out of the land that enslaved them. The Exodus has begun. Moses tells the people to remember this day. Passover is not to become a distant historical detail. Future generations must be taught that God brought Israel out of Egypt with a mighty hand. The people travel toward the wilderness. God leads them with a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. But Pharaoh changes his mind. The loss of Israel's labor becomes unbearable to Egypt's rulers. Pharaoh gathers chariots and pursues the former slaves. The Israelites find themselves trapped between the sea and the approaching Egyptian army. Fear spreads through the camp. They accuse Moses of bringing them into the wilderness to die. Egypt's slavery suddenly seems safer than the uncertainty of freedom. Moses tells them not to be afraid. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent. The cloud moves between Israel and the Egyptians. Throughout the night, God drives back the sea with a strong east wind, and the waters divide. The Israelites enter on dry ground. Walls of water stand beside them as families, livestock, and possessions move through the path opened in the sea. The Egyptians follow. At the morning watch, confusion seizes their forces. Their chariot wheels become difficult to drive. The soldiers recognize too late that the Lord is fighting for Israel. When the Israelites reach the other side, Moses stretches out his hand. The waters return. The army that had pursued them disappears beneath the sea. Israel stands on the shore and sees that the power which held them for generations has been broken. They fear the Lord and believe in him and in Moses his servant. Then Moses and the Israelites sing. The song celebrates the Lord as warrior and deliverer. Pharaoh's chariots and army have been thrown into the sea. The victory belongs not to Israel's weapons, but to God's power. Miriam the prophetess and sister of Aaron leads the women with tambourines and dancing. For one moment, the nation sings with one voice. But freedom introduces a new question. Israel has been brought out of Egypt. What kind of people will they now become? 3 days into the wilderness, they find no water. At Marah, the water is bitter and the people complain. God provides a way for the water to become drinkable. Soon they hunger and remember Egypt's food while forgetting its chains. God sends manna, a bread-like provision appearing with the morning dew. Each household gathers what it needs. They are instructed not to hoard it overnight, except before the Sabbath. Some disobey. The wilderness begins to reveal what slavery has formed within them: fear, distrust, and an instinct to secure life by accumulation rather than daily dependence. Quail comes in the evening. Manna comes in the morning. The people are fed. At Rephidim they again lack water and quarrel with Moses. They ask whether God is truly among them. Moses strikes the rock as instructed, and water comes out. Then Amalek attacks. Joshua leads Israel in battle, while Moses stands on the hill with the staff of God. As long as Moses' hands remain raised, Israel prevails. When his arms grow tired, Aaron and Hur support them until sunset. The victory is shared. Joshua fights Moses, intercedes, and others hold up the hands that can no longer remain lifted alone. Israel finally arrives at Mount Sinai. The mountain is the destination promised at the burning bush. God had told Moses that after bringing the people out of Egypt, they would worship at this mountain. Now the rescued slaves stand before the God who rescued them. God reminds them what He has done. He carried them as on eagle's wings and brought them to Himself. If they obey His voice and keep His covenant, they will be His treasured possession among all peoples, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Israel's calling is not merely to escape oppression. They are being formed into a people who will represent the character and rule of God among the nations. The people answer that they will do all the Lord has spoken. The mountain is covered with cloud. Thunder and lightning fill the air. A trumpet sounds with increasing intensity. Sinai trembles and smoke rises because the Lord descends in fire. The people are warned not to rush carelessly into the holy presence. God then speaks the words that will form the foundation of Israel's covenant life. They must have no other gods before Him. They must not make idols to represent Him. They must not misuse His name. They must remember the Sabbath. They must honor father and mother. They must not murder, commit adultery, steal, bear false witness, or covet what belongs to another. These commands are not given as a method for earning rescue. Israel has already been delivered from Egypt. The law shows how a redeemed people is to live in relationship with God and one another. Further instructions address worship, justice, servants, property, violence, restitution, care for foreigners, widows, and orphans. Israel must not reproduce Egypt's cruelty within its own society. They know what it is to be strangers. Therefore, they must not oppress the stranger. The covenant is confirmed with sacrifice. Moses reads the book of the covenant, and the people again promise obedience. Blood is placed upon the altar and then upon the people as a sign of the covenant bond. Moses, Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and 70 elders ascend part of the mountain. They behold a manifestation of the God of Israel and share a covenant meal in His presence. Then Moses goes higher. He remains on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights, receiving instructions for the tabernacle, a sacred dwelling through which God's presence will remain among His people. The tabernacle is to contain the Ark of the Covenant, the lampstand, the table, altars, curtains, and a carefully ordered priesthood. Everything communicates both nearness and holiness. The God who descended upon Sinai intends to dwell in the midst of the camp. But below the mountain, the people grow impatient. Moses has been gone too long. They gather around Aaron and demand gods who will go before them. They do not know what has become of Moses. Aaron collects gold earrings, fashions a calf, and builds an altar. The people declare that this image represents the power that brought them out of Egypt. The contradiction is astonishing. At the very mountain where they heard the command against idols, they create one. They exchange the unseen God who delivered them for an image they can control. The people feast and celebrate before the calf, while Moses receives the tablets of the covenant above them. God tells Moses that the people have corrupted themselves and threatens judgment. Moses intercedes, appealing to God's promises and to what Egypt and the nations would say if Israel were destroyed. When Moses descends and sees the calf and the dancing, he throws down the tablets, shattering them at the foot of the mountain. The broken stones become a visible sign of the covenant already broken by the people. Moses destroys the calf, grinds it to powder, scatters it on water, and makes Israel drink it. He confronts Aaron. Aaron attempts to shift responsibility, claiming that the people gave him gold and that the calf simply came out of the fire. The explanation exposes the weakness of the priestly leadership before it has even been fully established. Judgment falls within the camp. Yet Moses returns to God and pleads for the people. He is willing to be blotted out for their sake. But God makes clear that guilt cannot simply be transferred by human offer. The covenant stands at the edge of collapse. The people have been delivered from Egypt, crossed the sea, eaten bread from heaven, drunk water from the rock, heard God's voice, and promised obedience. Still they have turned toward an idol. The greatest threat to Israel is no longer Pharaoh behind them. It is rebellion within them. Moses asks God to show him his ways and to continue going with the people. Without the presence of God, there is no reason for Israel to move forward. God promises that his presence will go with them. Moses then asks to see his glory. He is placed in a cleft of the rock and allowed to perceive only what a human being can survive. God proclaims his name and character, merciful and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, forgiving sin, yet not treating guilt as though it does not matter. This revelation becomes one of the central descriptions of God throughout the Old Testament. New tablets are prepared. The covenant is renewed. When Moses comes down from the mountain, his face shines because he has been speaking with God. The people then contribute materials for the tabernacle so generously that they must eventually be told to stop. Skilled workers construct the sanctuary according to the pattern given to Moses. At last, the tabernacle is completed. The ark is placed inside. The curtains are hung. The altar is prepared. The priests are set apart for service. Then the cloud covers the tent, and the glory of the Lord fills the tabernacle so powerfully that even Moses cannot enter. The same presence that appeared in the burning bush, judged Egypt, divided the sea, and descended upon Sinai, now rests in the center of Israel's camp. The nation has received deliverance, covenant law, priesthood sacrifice, and the presence of God. But the land promised to Abraham still lies ahead. Between Sinai and Canaan stands the wilderness. And the generation that sang beside the sea will soon be asked whether it trusts the God who delivered it enough to enter the land he promised. The wilderness, the promised land, and the age of the judges. The glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle, and the camp of Israel was organized around the presence of God. At the center stood the sanctuary. Around it stood the tribes. Whenever the cloud lifted, the people moved. Whenever it remained, they stayed. The nation that had once built cities for Pharaoh now traveled according to the direction of the God who had delivered them. But the journey from Sinai to Canaan would reveal that leaving Egypt was easier than learning to trust. Before Israel could enter the land, the people had to learn how holiness, sacrifice, worship, justice, and community life fit together. The laws given through Moses were not a random collection of rituals. They established how a sinful people could live near a holy God. Priests were appointed from the family of Aaron. Sacrifices addressed guilt, thanksgiving, fellowship, and purification. The Day of Atonement provided an annual moment when the high priest entered the most holy place with blood, making atonement for the sanctuary and the people. The system taught Israel that sin was not a private inconvenience. It affected worship community and the people's relationship with God. Holiness also reached into ordinary life: food, disease, family, property, justice, and care for the poor. Israel was being shaped into a distinct covenant people. But sacred responsibility did not guarantee faithful leadership. Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, offered unauthorized fire before the Lord. Fire came out from the presence of God, and they died. The moment was severe. The priests who approached the sanctuary could not treat the holy presence as something ordinary or controllable. Israel had been invited near, but nearness required reverence. After nearly a year at Sinai, the cloud lifted. The people began moving toward the land promised to Abraham. The tribes marched in order. The ark went before them. The journey appeared ready to become a triumphal procession. Almost immediately, complaints began. The people grumbled about hardship. Some remembered the food of Egypt and spoke longingly of fish, cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic. Manna, the daily provision that had preserved them, became an object of contempt. Their memory distorted the past. They remembered Egypt's meals but forgot Egypt's bricks. Moses felt crushed by the burden of leadership. He asked God why the weight of the entire nation had been placed upon him. In response, 70 elders received help for the work, and quail came into the camp. But the people's uncontrolled craving brought judgment. Soon, even Moses' own family challenged him. Miriam and Aaron spoke against him, questioning whether the Lord had spoken only through Moses. The issue was not merely personal criticism. It was a challenge to the role God had assigned. Miriam was struck with a skin disease and removed from the camp for 7 days. Moses prayed for her healing, and the nation waited until she returned. The people were approaching the border of Canaan, but their greatest test had not yet come. At Kadesh, Moses selected 12 men, one from each tribe, to explore the land. For 40 days they traveled through Canaan. They saw fortified cities, powerful inhabitants, and rich agricultural land. They cut down a cluster of grapes so large that it had to be carried on a pole between 2 men. When the spies returned, they confirmed that the land flowed with abundance. But 10 of them focused on the danger. The cities were strong, the people were large, Israel seemed small and weak by comparison. Caleb urged the nation to go up and take possession, declaring that they could succeed. Joshua stood with him. The others spread fear through the camp. They described the land as devouring its inhabitants and claimed that Israel appeared like grasshoppers beside the people who lived there. The entire community cried through the night. They accused Moses and Aaron of bringing them into the wilderness to die. They proposed choosing another leader and returning to Egypt. This was not ordinary anxiety. The generation that had watched Egypt fall, walked through the sea, eaten manna, and stood at Sinai, now refused to trust the same God at the border of promise. Joshua and Caleb tore their clothes. They pleaded with the people not to rebel. If the Lord delighted in Israel, he would bring them into the land. The people responded by threatening to stone them. Then the glory of the Lord appeared. Judgment was announced. The generation that repeatedly tested God would not enter Canaan. Their children, whom they claimed would become victims, would inherit the land instead. The nation would wander in the wilderness for 40 years, corresponding to the days the spies had explored Canaan. Every adult counted in that unbelieving generation, except Joshua and Caleb, would die before the promise was entered. The people mourned, but their grief did not produce true obedience. The next morning, some attempted to invade Canaan without God's command. Moses warned them that the Lord was not with them. They went anyway. The Amalekites and Canaanites defeated them. Israel had refused to enter when God commanded, then tried to enter when He forbade. Rebellion could take the form of retreat or reckless action. In both cases, the people preferred their own judgment to the Word of God. The wilderness years became a long transition between generations. The text does not describe every day of those decades, but it records repeated crises that exposed the same struggle. Korah, Dathan, Abiram, and other leaders challenged Moses and Aaron. They claimed that the whole community was holy and accused Moses of exalting himself. Their words sounded like a defense of equality, but their rebellion was also a struggle for authority. Moses placed the matter before God. The earth opened beneath the households of some rebels, while fire consumed men who approached with unauthorized incense. The people still accused Moses and Aaron of causing the deaths, and another plague spread through the camp. Aaron stood between the living and the dead, with incense making atonement until the plague stopped. The priesthood that had been challenged became the means through which judgment was restrained. Later, the staff of each tribal leader was placed before the Lord. Aaron's staff budded, blossomed, and produced almonds, confirming the priestly line chosen for sanctuary service. Still, the wilderness continued. At Meribah, the people again complained because there was no water. Moses and Aaron went before the Lord, and God instructed Moses to speak to the rock. Instead, Moses spoke angrily to the people. "Hear now, you rebels! Shall we bring water for you out of this rock?" He struck the rock twice. Water came out, but Moses and Aaron had failed to honor God as holy before the congregation. As a result, they were told that they would not lead Israel into the land. Moses, the man who had confronted Pharaoh and stood upon Sinai, would see the promise from a distance, but would not complete the journey himself. Scripture does not hide the failures of its greatest leaders. The story was never sustained by human perfection. Aaron later died on Mount Hor. His priestly garments were transferred to his son Eleazar, and the congregation mourned. As Israel traveled around Edom, the people became impatient once more. They spoke against God and Moses, despising the food they had been given. Venomous serpents entered the camp, and many died. When the people confessed their sin, God instructed Moses to make a bronze serpent and lift it upon a pole. Anyone who looked at it lived. The object itself had no independent power. Healing came through trusting the remedy God provided. Many generations later, when the bronze serpent became an object of worship, King Hezekiah would destroy it. A sign meant to direct people toward God could become an idol when separated from its purpose. As Israel neared Canaan from the east, neighboring kingdoms began to fear them. Sihon, king of the Amorites, refused Israel passage and attacked. He was defeated. Og, king of Bashan, also fell. The nation that had retreated in fear decades earlier was now beginning to experience victory under a new generation. Balak, king of Moab, saw what Israel had done and hired a diviner named Balaam to curse them. Balaam's story is complex. He was not an Israelite prophet, yet God controlled what he was permitted to say. On his journey, Balaam failed to perceive danger that even his donkey could see. The animal turned aside from an angel standing in the path, while Balaam struck it in frustration. God opened the donkey's mouth, then opened Balaam's eyes. The man hired to see spiritual realities had been more blind than the animal beneath him. When Balaam finally stood overlooking Israel, he could not pronounce the curse Balak desired. Again and again, blessing came from his mouth instead. Among his words was a future vision of a star coming out of Jacob and a scepter rising from Israel. Yet Balaam's inability to curse Israel did not mean Israel could not bring destruction upon itself. At Peor, Israelite men were drawn into sexual immorality and the worship of Baal through relationships with Moabite and Midianite women. A plague followed. External curses had failed, but internal compromise succeeded. Once again, Israel's greatest danger came from rebellion within the covenant community. Before the people crossed the Jordan, Moses addressed the new generation on the plains of Moab. Deuteronomy presents these final speeches as covenant instruction, warning remembrance, and preparation. Moses reviewed the journey, repeated the law, and called Israel to love the Lord with all their heart, soul, and strength. He warned them not to forget once they entered houses they had not built and ate from fields they had not planted. Prosperity could become as dangerous as hardship. In the wilderness, Israel was tempted to doubt God because they lacked food. In the land, they would be tempted to forget Him because they had plenty. Moses set before them blessing and curse, life and death. Obedience would sustain covenant life in the land. Persistent rebellion would eventually lead to defeat and exile. The ending of the Old Testament story was already being warned about before Israel entered Canaan. Moses commissioned Joshua as his successor. He then climbed Mount Nebo and looked across the Jordan. From the mountain he saw the land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He had spent 40 years in Egypt, 40 years in Midian, and 40 years leading Israel through the wilderness. He had spoken with God, carried the burden of the people, interceded after rebellion, and received the covenant law. But he would not cross the river. Moses died in the land of Moab. The location of his grave was not known. Israel mourned him for 30 days. Deuteronomy remembers him as a prophet unlike any other in Israel, one whom the Lord knew face to face. Yet even Moses could not complete the entire promise. Joshua now stood before the river. God commanded him to be strong and courageous, not because the task was easy, but because the divine presence would continue with him. The Jordan was overflowing its banks. The priests carried the ark into the water, and the river stopped flowing. The people crossed on dry ground. The Exodus generation had passed through the sea while fleeing Egypt. Their children crossed the Jordan while entering Canaan. 12 stones were taken from the riverbed as a memorial. Future children would ask what the stones meant, and their parents were to tell them how God brought Israel across. The first great obstacle was Jericho. The city was fortified and closed against Israel. God gave instructions unlike a normal military strategy. For 6 days, the Israelites marched around the city once each day. Priests carried trumpets before the ark. On the 7th day, they marched around 7 times. At the signal, the priests blew the trumpets, the people shouted, and Jericho's walls fell. Rahab and her family were spared. Earlier, Rahab had hidden Israelite spies and confessed that the Lord Israel's God ruled heaven and earth. A scarlet cord marked her household for protection. The Canaanite woman living within Jericho became part of Israel's story because she responded in faith. But victory was followed by failure. God had placed Jericho under the ban, meaning its goods were not to be taken for private gain. A man named Achan secretly kept valuable items. When Israel attacked the smaller city of Ai, the army was defeated. Joshua fell before the Lord in grief, but the problem was not divine weakness. Covenant unfaithfulness had entered the camp. Achan's sin was exposed and judgment followed. Only then did Israel defeat Ai. The conquest continued through campaigns in the south and north. At Gibeon, local inhabitants deceived Israel into making a treaty by pretending to come from a distant land. The leaders examined their provisions, but did not seek guidance from the Lord. When the deception was discovered, the covenant could not simply be ignored. The Gibeonites were preserved but assigned service connected to the sanctuary. Soon, a coalition of kings attacked Gibeon because of its agreement with Israel. Joshua came to its defense. During the battle, he called for the sun and moon to stand still. The text presents the day as an extraordinary act of divine intervention that allowed Israel's victory to be completed. The conquest narratives describe severe judgment upon Canaanite societies. They are not presented as permission for later nations to claim land through religious violence. Within the biblical story, these events are tied to a specific judgment, a specific covenant moment, and commands given to ancient Israel. Even after major victories, the land was not fully settled. Joshua divided territories among the tribes. Caleb, now an old man, asked for the hill country he had been promised decades earlier. The faithful spy from the previous generation was still ready to face fortified cities. Cities of refuge were established for those who caused death without premeditated murder. The Levites received towns among the tribes rather than one large territory of their own. The tabernacle was set up at Shiloh. Toward the end of his life, Joshua gathered Israel and reminded them of the entire journey from Abraham's call through Egypt, the Exodus, the wilderness, and the conquest. He called them to choose whom they would serve. The people declared that they would serve the Lord. Joshua warned them not to make the promise lightly. Covenant loyalty required the removal of foreign gods and genuine devotion. Joshua died, and the generation that had witnessed God's works eventually passed away. Then another generation arose that did not know the Lord or the works he had done for Israel. The statement does not necessarily mean they had never heard the stories. It means the knowledge had not become covenant faithfulness. Israel failed to drive out many remaining Canaanite groups. The unfinished conquest created a setting in which the people adopted the worship and practices of their neighbors. The book of Judges describes a repeating cycle. Israel abandons the Lord. A foreign power oppresses them. The people cry out. God raises a deliverer. The land experiences rest. Then the cycle begins again, often with deeper corruption than before. Othniel delivers Israel from a Mesopotamian ruler. Ehud, a left-handed Benjaminite, kills Eglon, king of Moab, and leads Israel to victory. Shamgar strikes down Philistines with an ox goad. Deborah serves as a prophetess and judge. She calls Barak to lead Israel against Sisera, commander of a Canaanite army equipped with iron chariots. Barak agrees only if Deborah goes with him. The battle turns, and Sisera flees on foot. He enters the tent of Jael, expecting safety. Instead, while he sleeps, she kills him. The victory song of Deborah and Barak celebrates the tribes that came willingly and exposes those that remain distant. For a time, the land has peace. Then Midianite raiders begin devastating Israel's crops. Families hide in caves and strongholds. The Midianites arrive at harvest and leave the land stripped. Gideon is threshing wheat in a winepress, hiding the little grain he has, when the angel of the Lord calls him a mighty warrior. Gideon does not feel mighty. He asks where God's wonders are and why Israel has been abandoned. God sends him to deliver Israel. Gideon asks for signs. He tears down his father's altar to Baal, but does so at night because he's afraid. His faith is real, yet mixed with fear. An army gathers, but God reduces it to only 300 men, so Israel cannot claim victory through its own strength. At night, Gideon's men surround the Midianite camp with trumpets jars and torches. They break the jars, reveal the lights, blow the trumpets, and shout. Confusion spreads through the enemy camp, and Midian turns against itself. Gideon refuses the formal title of king, declaring that the Lord should rule Israel. Yet his later actions become increasingly king-like. He accumulates wealth, takes many wives, and names one son Abimelech, a name meaning, "My father is king." He also makes a golden ephod that becomes an object of false worship. The deliverer who rejected a crown still created the conditions for dynastic ambition and idolatry. After Gideon's death, Abimelech murders most of his brothers and makes himself king in Shechem. His violent rule ends in violence. The cycle continues. Jephthah, the son of a prostitute and a rejected man, is called back by the elders of Gilead when war comes. He wins a military victory, but makes a reckless vow concerning whatever comes out of his house to meet him. His daughter, his only child, comes out to welcome him. The text is tragic and disturbing. It shows how deeply Israel's thinking has been shaped by the surrounding cultures. The Lord had never required such a vow. Jephthah's story is followed by conflict between Israelite tribes, showing that the nation's violence is no longer directed only outward. Then comes Samson. Before his birth, his mother receives a promise that he will begin to deliver Israel from the Philistines. He is set apart as a Nazirite, marked by special restrictions and uncut hair. Samson possesses extraordinary strength, but little self-control. He repeatedly pursues Philistine women, responds to insults with escalating violence, and treats his calling as though personal desire and divine purpose are the same thing. At times, God uses Samson's conflicts to strike the Philistines, but Samson's victories do not produce stable leadership or national renewal. Delilah eventually presses him to reveal the secret connected to his strength. After repeated deception, he tells her about his uncut hair. While he sleeps, his hair is cut. The Philistines seize him, blind him, and force him to grind grain in prison. The man who had followed what was right in his own eyes loses his physical sight. During a Philistine celebration, Samson is brought into the temple of Dagon as entertainment. He prays for strength one final time, braces himself against the supporting pillars, and brings the structure down upon himself and the gathered rulers. In death, he kills more Philistines than during his life. But even this dramatic act does not free Israel completely. The final chapters of Judges move away from foreign oppression and reveal the collapse within Israel itself. A Levite establishes a private shrine with stolen silver and idol and an unauthorized priest. The tribe of Dan steals the religious objects and sets up its own worship center. Another Levite travels with his concubine and stays in Gibeah, a Benjaminite city. The men of the city surround the house in a scene deliberately echoing Sodom. The woman is abused through the night and dies. The Levite divides her body and sends the pieces throughout Israel, provoking national outrage and civil war. The tribe of Benjamin is nearly destroyed. Then, Israel's leaders attempt to solve the crisis through further violence and the seizure of women. The book closes without a judge capable of restoring the nation. Its repeated verdict explains the chaos. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. The statement does not mean that any king would solve the problem. It reveals the absence of faithful covenant leadership and the rejection of God's authority. Yet within this dark period, another story unfolds quietly in Bethlehem. A famine causes a man named Elimelech to leave Judah with his wife Naomi and their 2 sons. They settle in Moab. Elimelech dies. The sons marry Moabite women Ruth and Orpah, but after about 10 years, both sons also die. Naomi is left without her husband and children. Hearing that the Lord has provided food in Judah, she decides to return. She urges her daughters-in-law to remain in Moab and rebuild their lives. Orpah tearfully returns. Ruth refuses to leave Naomi. She commits herself to Naomi's people and to Naomi's God. Her loyalty carries her away from her homeland and into an uncertain future. The 2 women arrive in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. Naomi tells the townspeople not to call her pleasant but bitter, because she believes she has returned empty. Yet Ruth stands beside her, and the harvest has just begun. Ruth goes to gather grain left behind by harvesters, a provision in Israel's law for the poor and the foreigner. She happens to enter the field of Boaz, a relative of Elimelech. Boaz has heard of Ruth's loyalty. He protects her, provides food, and instructs his workers to leave extra grain for her. Naomi recognizes Boaz as one of their family redeemers, a relative who may have legal responsibilities connected to preserving family property and lineage. Following Naomi's guidance, Ruth approaches Boaz and asks him to spread his protection over her. Boaz responds with honor. He is willing to act, but another relative has a prior legal claim. At the city gate, the matter is settled. Before witnesses, the nearer relative declines when he realizes that redeeming the property also involves taking responsibility for Ruth and preserving the family line. Boaz accepts. He marries Ruth, and she gives birth to Obed. The women of Bethlehem tell Naomi that the child has restored hope to her life. Obed becomes the father of Jesse. Jesse becomes the father of David. In the age when everyone did what was right in his own eyes, God was quietly preserving a line of covenant faithfulness through a Moabite widow, an honorable landowner, and a child born in Bethlehem. The path toward kingship was being prepared far from palaces and battlefields. But before David, another transition would come. At Shiloh, the priest Eli served while his sons abused their authority. They treated offerings with contempt and exploited those who came to worship. A woman named Hannah came to the sanctuary in deep sorrow because she had no child. She prayed silently, promising that if God gave her a son, she would dedicate him to the Lord. Eli initially mistook her grief for drunkenness, but after hearing her explanation, he blessed her. Hannah gave birth to Samuel. When he was old enough, she brought him to Shiloh and entrusted him to the service of the Lord. The child grew in the sanctuary, while the established priestly household moved toward judgment. One night, Samuel heard his name called. He assumed Eli was speaking and went to him. After the call came repeatedly, Eli understood and instructed Samuel to answer. "Speak, Lord, for your servant hears." The message Samuel received announced judgment upon Eli's house. Soon, Israel went to battle against the Philistines. After an initial defeat, the leaders brought the Ark of the Covenant from Shiloh, as though its presence guaranteed victory. They treated the ark like a weapon or charm. The Philistines defeated Israel, killed Eli's sons, and captured the ark. When Eli heard the news, he fell backward and died. Yet the Philistines quickly discovered that possessing the ark did not mean controlling Israel's God. Their idol Dagon fell before it. Plagues struck their cities. Eventually, they returned the ark with offerings. God's presence could not be manipulated by Israel or conquered by Philistia. Samuel became a prophet, judge, and national leader. He called Israel to put away foreign gods and return to the Lord. Under his leadership, the Philistines were defeated, and a stone of remembrance was raised. Samuel named it Ebenezer, saying, "Thus far the Lord has helped us." But Samuel grew old. His sons did not walk in his ways. They pursued dishonest gain, accepted bribes, and perverted justice. The elders of Israel gathered and demanded change. "Appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations." Their concern about corrupt leadership was understandable, but their request revealed a deeper desire. They did not merely want justice. They wanted to become like the nations around them. They wanted a visible ruler to judge them, lead them, and fight their battles. Samuel was displeased, but God told him to listen. The people had not simply rejected Samuel, they had rejected the Lord as their king. Samuel warned them what a human monarchy could become. A king would take sons for armies, daughters for service fields, for officials and portions of their harvest. The people might one day cry out because of the ruler they demanded. They refused to listen. "No," they said, "there shall be a king over us." The age of the judges was ending. Israel believed that a crown could solve the rebellion within the nation. Soon, a tall young man from the tribe of Benjamin would enter the story. He would look exactly like the kind of king the people imagined. But the question was not whether Israel could place a man upon a throne. The question was whether the king himself would bow before the true king. Saul, David, and the rise of the United Kingdom. Israel had demanded a king who could stand before the nation, lead its armies, and make the people like the kingdoms around them. The man chosen first appeared to fit that desire perfectly. Saul was from the tribe of Benjamin, the son of a wealthy man named Kish. He was physically impressive, taller than anyone else in Israel, and nothing about his appearance suggested weakness. Yet Saul did not begin his story by searching for a throne. He was searching for lost donkeys. Kish sent Saul and a servant through the hill country, but after days of searching they found nothing. The servant suggested consulting Samuel the prophet, who lived nearby. Before Saul arrived, God had already told Samuel that a man from Benjamin would come. Samuel was to anoint him as ruler over Israel and use him to begin delivering the nation from Philistine oppression. When Saul entered the city, he did not yet know that the ordinary search which brought him there would change the history of Israel. Samuel welcomed him, gave him the place of honor at a meal, and revealed that the desire of Israel was turning toward him. Saul responded with surprise. Benjamin was one of Israel's smallest tribes, and his clan was not among its most prominent. The next morning Samuel poured oil upon Saul's head and kissed him. The first king of Israel was anointed in private. Samuel then gave Saul a series of signs confirming the call. Saul would meet particular people and receive bread, encounter a group of prophets, and experience the Spirit of God coming powerfully upon him. The signs occurred as Samuel had said. Saul joined the prophets, and those who knew him asked in astonishment, "Is Saul also among the prophets?" But when Samuel later assembled the tribes publicly to identify the king, Saul could not be found. He was hiding among the baggage. The man who stood taller than everyone else attempted to make himself invisible. He was brought forward, and Samuel presented him to the people. They shouted, "Long live the king!" Not everyone accepted him. Some questioned how Saul could save Israel and refused to honor him. Saul remained silent. His opportunity to establish authority came when Nahash the Ammonite besieged Jabesh-Gilead. Nahash offered a humiliating treaty. The people could surrender only if every man allowed his right eye to be gouged out. When Saul heard the news, the Spirit of God rushed upon him, and his anger burned. He summoned Israel to battle. The tribes gathered, Saul divided the army and struck the Ammonites before the heat of the day. The victory was decisive. Afterward, some of Saul's supporters wanted to execute those who had doubted him. Saul refused. "No man shall be put to death this day," he declared, "for today the Lord has worked salvation in Israel." At Gilgal, the people renewed the kingdom. Saul's reign began with courage, restraint, and the power of God. But the deeper question was not whether Saul could win a battle. It was whether he could remain obedient when fear, delay, and power placed pressure upon him. The Philistine threat soon intensified. Saul's son Jonathan attacked a Philistine outpost, provoking a major response. The Philistines gathered chariots, cavalry, and soldiers so numerous that Israel's troops began hiding in caves, pits, rocks, and tombs. Saul waited at Gilgal for Samuel to arrive and offer the sacrifice. As the days passed, the army scattered. Fear narrowed Saul's vision. Instead of continuing to wait, he offered the burnt offering himself. Samuel arrived immediately afterward. Saul explained that the people were deserting, the Philistines were gathering, and Samuel had not come at the expected time. He felt compelled to act. His reasoning sounded practical, but Samuel identified the deeper failure. Saul had not kept the command of the Lord. The kingdom would not continue through his line. God would seek a man after his own heart, not a flawless man, but one whose kingship would remain accountable to divine authority. Saul was still king, but the future of his dynasty had already been placed under judgment. Jonathan soon demonstrated the trust his father lacked. With only his armor-bearer, he approached a Philistine outpost and declared that nothing could prevent the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few. The two men attacked, and panic spread through the Philistine camp. Israel's hidden soldiers emerged and joined the battle. But Saul had placed the army under a reckless oath, forbidding anyone from eating before evening. Jonathan, unaware of the command, tasted honey and regained strength. When Saul later learned what had happened, he was prepared to execute his own son. The soldiers intervened, insisting that Jonathan, through whom God had brought victory, must not die. Saul's leadership was becoming increasingly shaped by impulsive commands, concern for appearances, and decisions that endangered the people he was meant to lead. The decisive break came when Samuel instructed Saul to carry out judgment against Amalek. Saul defeated the Amalekites, but spared King Agag and kept the best livestock, destroying only what appeared worthless. When Samuel confronted him, Saul claimed that he had obeyed. The sound of animals in the background contradicted his words. Saul blamed the people and then attempted to present the preserved animals as offerings for God. Samuel answered with one of the defining declarations of Israel's monarchy: "To obey is better than sacrifice." Religious action could not replace submission. Worship could not be used to decorate rebellion. Saul finally admitted that he had sinned because he feared the people and listened to their voice. Yet he still asked Samuel to honor him before the elders. Even in confession, Saul remained concerned with public appearance. Samuel announced that the kingdom had been torn from him and would be given to another. Then Samuel executed Agag, completing the judgment Saul had refused to carry out. Samuel grieved over Saul. God then sent him to Bethlehem, to the household of Jesse. Samuel expected Jesse's oldest son, Eliab, to be the chosen one. Eliab appeared strong and kingly, but God warned Samuel not to judge by appearance or height. Human beings look at the outward form. The Lord looks at the heart. One by one, Jesse's sons passed before Samuel, but none was chosen. At last, Samuel asked whether there was another. The youngest was away keeping sheep. David was called from the fields. He was young, healthy, and striking in appearance, but he did not possess the public stature associated with Saul. God told Samuel to rise and anoint him. Oil was poured upon David, and the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him from that day forward. The future king returned to the sheep. The anointing gave him a calling, not an immediate throne. Meanwhile, the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and he became tormented. His servants searched for a skilled musician who could play the lyre and bring him relief. David was recommended. Without knowing the full meaning of what had happened in Bethlehem, Saul brought his future successor into the royal court. David played Saul, found relief, and the king grew fond of him. The anointed shepherd now moved between the fields of Bethlehem and the palace of Israel. Then the Philistines gathered for war in the valley of Elah. Their champion, Goliath of Gath, came out day after day and challenged Israel to send one man against him. His armor, weapons, and height turned him into a symbol of Philistine dominance. Saul and the army were terrified. David arrived not as a soldier, but as a messenger carrying food from Jesse to his older brothers. He heard Goliath defy Israel and asked why no one would confront him. His eldest brother accused him of pride, but David saw the situation differently from the army. Goliath was not merely insulting Israel, he was defying the living God. Saul warned that David was only a youth, while Goliath had trained for war. David answered by describing how he had defended his father's sheep from lions and bears. The same God who delivered him before would deliver him again. David refused Saul's armor because he had not tested it. He went toward the Philistine with his staff sling and 5 smooth stones. Goliath mocked him. David replied that the Philistine came with sword and spear, but he came in the name of the Lord of hosts. The battle belonged to God. David ran toward Goliath, placed a stone in his sling, and struck the giant in the forehead. Goliath fell. David used Goliath's own sword to kill him, and the Philistine army fled. The frightened shepherd had become Israel's champion. The victory changed David's position overnight. Saul placed him over military forces, and David succeeded in every assignment. Jonathan, Saul's son, formed a deep covenant friendship with him. Jonathan gave David his robe, armor, sword, bow, and belt, symbols that carried the weight of royal identity. The heir to Saul's throne recognized something in David that Saul increasingly feared. When the army returned from battle, women sang that Saul had struck down thousands, while David had struck down tens of thousands. The song did not necessarily intend to reject Saul, but jealousy took root in him. From that day, Saul watched David with suspicion. As David played the lyre, Saul hurled a spear at him. David escaped. Saul became afraid because he saw that the Lord was with David. The king, who once appeared to possess everything, now feared the young man who did not yet possess a throne. Saul attempted to destroy David through warfare, offering his daughter in marriage on the condition that David fight dangerous battles against the Philistines. David survived and succeeded. He married Saul's daughter, Michal, who loved him. Jonathan also defended David and persuaded Saul for a time not to kill him. But Saul's jealousy returned. Another spear was thrown. Soldiers were sent to arrest David in his home. Michal helped him escape through a window and placed an idol in the bed to delay the pursuers. David became a fugitive. He fled to Samuel, then to the sanctuary at Nob, where the priest Ahimelech gave him consecrated bread and Goliath's sword. David concealed the truth about his situation, telling the priest that he was on a royal mission. That deception would have terrible consequences. Saul later learned that Ahimelech had helped David. The priest explained that he had known nothing of David's conflict with the king. Saul ordered the priests to be killed. His own guards refused, but Doeg the Edomite carried out the command. Nob, the city of the priests, was destroyed. Only Abiathar escaped and joined David. Saul, who had once refused to complete judgment against Amalek, now slaughtered Israelite priests in his rage against David. David accepted responsibility for what had happened. While Saul's court descended into fear, David gathered a very different community. Men in distress, debt, and bitterness came to him. His family joined him. Over time, this group became a disciplined fighting force. But the wilderness did not immediately make David a perfect leader. It tested his motives. Twice, David received an opportunity to kill Saul. In a cave at En-Gedi, Saul unknowingly entered the place where David and his men were hiding. David's men saw the moment as divine permission to take the throne. David cut off a corner of Saul's robe, but afterward his conscience troubled him. He refused to kill the Lord's anointed. From a distance, David showed Saul the piece of cloth and proved that he had spared him. Saul wept and admitted that David was more righteous. He acknowledged that David would one day be king. But Saul's remorse did not create lasting change. Later, David entered Saul's camp at night and took the spear and water jar beside the sleeping king. Again, he refused to kill him. David would not seize the kingdom through murder. The crown had been promised, but he would not force the timing. Between these two moments came the story of Nabal and Abigail. David's men had protected Nabal's shepherds and flocks, but when David requested provisions, Nabal insulted him. David reacted with anger and prepared to kill every male in Nabal's household. The man who refused to murder Saul was ready to destroy an entire family over wounded honor. Abigail, Nabal's wife, acted quickly. She brought food, met David on the road, and pleaded with him not to shed blood in personal vengeance. David recognized the wisdom of her intervention. After Nabal died, David married Abigail. Her courage had prevented the future king from committing an act that would have stained his rule before it began. The wilderness was shaping David, but not because he never failed. It was shaping him because he could still be corrected. Eventually, David sought refuge among the Philistines and entered the service of Achish, king of Gath. He was given Ziklag and lived there with his men. David's position became morally dangerous. He raided enemy groups, but misled Achish about where he had gone. Achish came to trust him and believed David had made himself hated by Israel. When the Philistines prepared for a major battle against Saul, Achish expected David to join them. Other Philistine commanders objected, fearing that David might turn against them during battle. David was sent back. Upon returning to Ziklag, he found the city burned and the families taken captive by Amalekite raiders. David's own men spoke of stoning him because of their grief. But David strengthened himself in the Lord. He sought guidance, pursued the raiders, and rescued every captive. Nothing was missing. While David recovered the families of his followers, Saul faced his final night. The Philistine army gathered at Mount Gilboa. Samuel was dead. Saul sought guidance from the Lord, but received no answer. In desperation, he consulted a medium at Endor, violating the very law he had once enforced. Saul asked her to bring up Samuel. The encounter announced no new path of escape. Samuel's message confirmed the judgment already spoken. Saul and his sons would fall, and Israel's army would be defeated. The next day, the Philistines overwhelmed Israel. Jonathan and Saul's other sons were killed. Saul was wounded by archers. Fearing capture and humiliation, he asked his armor-bearer to kill him. When the man refused, Saul fell upon his own sword. The first king of Israel died on Mount Gilboa. The men of Jabesh-Gilead, the city Saul had saved at the beginning of his reign, recovered his body and honored him in death. When David heard the news, he did not celebrate. He tore his clothes and mourned for Saul and Jonathan. He composed a lament, remembering their strength and grieving the loss of his beloved friend. How the mighty have fallen! David did not reduce Saul to his worst moments. He honored the tragedy of a king who had once been chosen, empowered, and victorious, but who gradually allowed fear and jealousy to rule him. David then asked God whether he should return to Judah. He was directed to Hebron, where the men of Judah anointed him as king. But the rest of Israel did not immediately follow. Abner, commander of Saul's army, installed Saul's son Ishbosheth over the northern tribes. A long conflict began between the house of Saul and the house of David. David grew stronger while Saul's house weakened. The transition was marked by rivalry, political negotiation, and bloodshed. Abner eventually broke with Ishbosheth and offered to bring Israel under David's rule. But Joab, David's military commander, killed Abner in revenge for the death of his brother. David publicly mourned Abner and distanced himself from the murder, yet Joab's violent influence would remain a problem throughout the reign. Ishbosheth was later murdered by two of his own captains. They carried his head to David, expecting a reward. Instead, David ordered their execution. He would not build his kingdom by rewarding assassination. At last, the elders of all Israel came to Hebron. They acknowledged that even when Saul was king, David had led Israel's armies. They also recognized the word of God that David would shepherd the people. David was anointed king over all Israel. The fugitive had become ruler of the united tribes. His first major act was to capture Jerusalem from the Jebusites. The city stood in a strategic location between northern and southern territories and had not belonged exclusively to any one tribe. David made it his capital. Jerusalem became the city of David. The Philistines attacked when they heard that David had been crowned. David sought God's direction and defeated them. He then determined to bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. The first attempt ended in tragedy. The Ark was placed on a cart rather than carried according to the prescribed order. When the oxen stumbled, Uzzah reached out and touched the Ark. He died beside it. David became angry and afraid. The Ark remained for a time in the household of Obed-Edom, where blessing followed. Later, David brought it to Jerusalem with sacrifice, celebration, and reverence. He danced before the Lord with all his strength. Michal, Saul's daughter, watched from a window and despised him. When she criticized what she considered undignified behavior, David answered that his celebration was before the Lord. The Ark entered Jerusalem. David lived in a palace, but the symbol of God's presence remained in a tent. He told the prophet Nathan that he wanted to build a house for God. At first, Nathan approved, but that night, God gave him a different message. David would not build the house. Instead, God would build a house for David. The word house shifted from a building to a dynasty. God promised that David's offspring would succeed him, that his kingdom would be established, and that his throne would endure. The king wanted to construct a temple. God answered with a covenant. This promise would become one of the great lines of hope running through the rest of the Old Testament. Even when David's descendants failed and the kingdom eventually collapsed, the question would remain, what had become of the promised throne? David responded with humility. Who am I, O Lord God, and what is my house, that you have brought me thus far? His kingdom expanded, enemies were defeated, borders became secure. David showed kindness to Mephibosheth, Jonathan's disabled son, giving him a place at the royal table and restoring Saul's family property to him. It appeared that the kingdom had reached stability. Then in the season when kings went out to battle, David remained in Jerusalem. From the roof of his palace, he saw Bathsheba bathing. She was the wife of Uriah the Hittite, one of David's soldiers. David sent for her and slept with her. Bathsheba became pregnant. David attempted to hide what he had done by bringing Uriah home from the battlefield. But Uriah refused to enjoy the comforts of his house while the ark and the army remained in the field. David then sent Uriah back, carrying a letter that arranged his own death. Joab placed him where the fighting was most dangerous and withdrew support. Uriah was killed. After the period of mourning, David took Bathsheba into his house. The king who once protected sheep, refused to kill Saul, and defended Israel, had used royal power to take another man's wife and arrange another man's death. The text states plainly that what David had done displeased the Lord. Nathan came to him with a story. A rich man with many flocks had taken the single beloved lamb of a poor man to feed a traveler. David became angry and declared that the man deserved judgment. Nathan answered, "You are the man." David had judged his own actions without recognizing himself in the story. Nathan announced that the sword would not depart from David's house. What David had done in secret would produce public consequences. David confessed, "I have sinned against the Lord." Unlike Saul, he did not immediately blame the people or demand public honor. His repentance was real. But forgiveness did not erase every consequence. The child born to Bathsheba died. Later she gave birth to Solomon, whom the Lord loved. Yet violence began spreading through David's family. Amnon, David's eldest son, became obsessed with his half-sister Tamar. Through deception, he isolated and violated her, then rejected her. Tamar's brother Absalom took her into his house and waited. David was angry, but the text records no effective justice. 2 years later, Absalom arranged Amnon's murder. Then he fled. David longed for Absalom, and eventually the prince returned to Jerusalem. But reconciliation remained incomplete. Absalom began building support among the people, presenting himself as the leader who would give them justice. He stole the hearts of Israel. Then he declared himself king at Hebron. David fled Jerusalem with loyal followers. He crossed the Kidron Valley and climbed the Mount of Olives, weeping barefoot with his head covered. The king who had entered Jerusalem in triumph now left it in humiliation. David refused to use the ark as a guarantee of victory. He sent it back to the city, saying that if God favored him, he would return. Absalom entered Jerusalem and took possession of the palace. The rebellion ended in battle in the forest of Ephraim. David ordered his commanders to deal gently with Absalom. But Absalom became caught by his hair or head in the branches of a tree while his mule moved on. Joab ignored David's command and killed him. When the news reached David, the king broke down. "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you." The victory that restored David's throne felt like defeat. David returned to Jerusalem, but the kingdom remained unstable. Tribal tensions continued. Another rebellion rose under Sheba. Joab again used violence to preserve power. In David's final years, even the numbering of Israel brought crisis. David ordered a census of the fighting men, despite warnings from Joab. The text presents the act as sinful, likely because it reflected pride, military confidence, or an attempt to measure the kingdom as though its strength belonged to the king. After the count, David's conscience struck him. A plague came upon Israel. When David saw the angel of judgment near Jerusalem, he pleaded that the punishment fall upon him and his house rather than the people. He built an altar on the threshing floor of Araunah, and the plague stopped. That location would later become the site connected with Solomon's temple. David's life was drawing to a close, but the succession remained uncertain. Adonijah, another of David's sons, declared himself king without David's approval. He gathered supporters including Joab and the priest Abiathar. Nathan and Bathsheba went to the aging king and reminded him that Solomon had been designated as successor. David acted. Solomon was placed upon the royal mule, anointed by the priest Zadok and Nathan the prophet, and proclaimed king. The people celebrated so loudly that the ground seemed to shake. Adonijah's attempted coronation collapsed. David gave Solomon final instructions. He urged him to walk faithfully before God and also directed him to resolve unfinished political threats within the kingdom. Then David died. The shepherd from Bethlehem had become warrior, fugitive, king, conqueror, worshipper, covenant-bearer, adulterer, murderer, repentant sinner, grieving father, and founder of a dynasty. Scripture did not hide his faith. It also did not hide his failures. David had united the tribes, established Jerusalem, brought the ark to the capital, expanded the kingdom, and received a promise that would shape biblical hope for generations. But he left Solomon more than a throne. He left him a powerful kingdom, a divided royal family, dangerous officials, unfinished justice, and a covenant promise far greater than any one king could carry. Solomon would inherit peace, wealth, and the opportunity to build the temple David had imagined. He would also inherit every unresolved fracture beneath the glory of the United Kingdom. The temple and the divided kingdom. Solomon inherited a kingdom larger, wealthier, and more secure than anything Israel had known before. David had fought the wars. Solomon inherited the peace. But peace created its own test. David had been shaped in caves, battlefields, and exile. Solomon would be shaped in palaces, diplomatic courts, building projects, and abundance. The danger was no longer that the kingdom would be destroyed from outside. The danger was that success would slowly change what the king trusted. At the beginning of Solomon's reign, the throne was not yet secure. Adonijah, who had previously attempted to make himself king, asked to marry Abishag, the young woman who had attended David in his final days. In the politics of the ancient royal court, such a marriage could carry a claim to the former king's household and authority. Solomon recognized the request as another challenge to the throne and ordered Adonijah's execution. Abiathar the priest was removed from office because he had supported Adonijah. Joab fled to the altar seeking protection, but he was killed for the innocent blood he had shed during David's reign. Benaiah replaced him as commander, and Zadok became the chief priest. Solomon's kingdom was established, but its first days were marked by judgment upon unresolved conflicts from David's house. Then the young king traveled to Gibeon, where the tabernacle and a major altar stood. There he offered sacrifices. During the night, God appeared to him in a dream. "Ask what I shall give you." Solomon could have asked for long life, wealth, or victory over his enemies. Instead, he spoke of his inexperience and the responsibility of governing a great people. He asked for an understanding heart to discern between good and evil and judge Israel wisely. God was pleased. Because Solomon had not asked first for personal power, God granted him wisdom and also promised riches and honor beyond the kings of his generation. Yet the promise of long life remained connected to obedience. Wisdom was given. Faithfulness would still have to be chosen. Soon 2 women came before the king, each claiming to be the mother of the same infant. One woman's child had died during the night, and both now claimed the living son. There were no witnesses. Solomon ordered a sword to be brought and declared that the child should be divided between them. The true mother immediately begged that the baby be given alive to the other woman. The other claimant accepted the proposed division. Solomon gave the child to the woman willing to surrender him. The judgment spread throughout Israel, and the people recognized that divine wisdom was operating through their king. Solomon organized the kingdom with officials, districts, military resources, and systems of taxation and supply. His court became known for wealth, order, and learning. He spoke thousands of proverbs and songs. He studied plants, animals, birds, reptiles, and fish. Rulers and representatives came from surrounding nations to hear his wisdom. Israel lived in security, described as sitting under vine and fig tree. The promise to Abraham seemed to be taking visible form. The people had multiplied. They possessed the land. Their king ruled from Jerusalem. Nations were being drawn toward the wisdom found in Israel. Now Solomon prepared to build the temple David had desired. He made an agreement with Hiram, king of Tyre, who supplied cedar and skilled labor. Large stones were cut and prepared. Thousands of workers were organized for the project. The temple rose upon the mountain in Jerusalem. Its design reflected features of the tabernacle, but in permanent and magnificent form. There was an outer court, a main hall, and the inner sanctuary known as the Most Holy Place. Cherubim overshadowed the place prepared for the ark. Gold-covered walls, furnishings, and sacred objects. Carvings of flowers, palm trees, and cherubim recalled the beauty of creation and the guarded holiness of Eden. 2 great pillars stood at the entrance. The temple was not built because God needed shelter. Solomon himself would later acknowledge that even the highest heaven could not contain him. The building represented something else. The covenant God had chosen to place his name among his people at the center of their worship and national life. After years of construction, the priests brought the ark from the city of David into the temple. The elders gathered. Sacrifices were offered. The ark was carried into the most holy place, beneath the wings of the cherubim. Inside were the tablets of the covenant given through Moses. The kingdom at its height was being connected to Sinai. Then the cloud filled the temple. The priests could not continue their service because the glory of the Lord filled the house. The presence that had rested over the tabernacle in the wilderness now filled the temple in Jerusalem. Solomon stood before the altar and prayed. He praised God for keeping the covenant with David. He asked that the temple become a place toward which Israel could pray in times of sin, defeat drought, famine, disease, war, and exile. He also prayed for the foreigner who came because of God's great name. The temple was connected not only to Israel's worship, but also to the possibility that the nations might come to know the God of Israel. Yet Solomon's prayer included a warning. He understood that Israel might sin, be defeated, and even be carried away to another land. He asked God to hear when the people repented and turned toward him. At the dedication of the temple, the possibility of exile already stood in the background. God later appeared to Solomon and affirmed that he had heard the prayer. But the temple was not an unconditional guarantee of safety. If Solomon and his descendants walked faithfully, the Davidic throne would continue. If they turned aside to serve other gods, Israel would be removed from the land, and the temple would become a ruin and an object of astonishment. The building was holy because of the God who placed his name there. It could not protect a nation determined to reject the covenant. For a time, Solomon's glory continued to grow. His fleets traded through distant ports, gold flowed into Jerusalem, silver became so common that it was treated as having little value. His throne was decorated with ivory and gold, his military strength expanded with horses and chariots. The Queen of Sheba came to test Solomon with difficult questions. She saw his wisdom, the organization of his court, the food on his table, the clothing of his servants, and the offerings made at the temple. She was overwhelmed. She praised the God of Israel for placing Solomon on the throne to maintain justice and righteousness. This was what Israel's kingship could have become: wisdom serving justice, prosperity producing wonder, and the nations recognizing the goodness of God. But beneath the splendor, the foundation was beginning to shift. The law of Moses had warned that Israel's king should not multiply horses, wives, or excessive wealth for himself. Each of these could turn the king away from dependence upon God. Solomon accumulated all three. His horses were connected with Egypt and international trade. His gold became legendary. His many marriages were often political alliances with surrounding nations. Among his wives were women from Moab, Ammon, Edom, Sidon, and other peoples whose religious practices threatened Israel's covenant faithfulness. The problem was not merely their foreign ancestry. Ruth had been a Moabite and had shown extraordinary loyalty to Israel's God. The danger was the worship Solomon permitted and eventually joined. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods. He built high places for deities such as Chemosh and Molech, whose worship stood in direct opposition to the covenant. The king who built the temple of the Lord also built sanctuaries for idols. The man who had asked for a discerning heart no longer gave his whole heart to the God who granted that wisdom. Solomon's failure did not begin with one dramatic rejection. It grew through tolerated compromise. Political necessity became religious accommodation. Accommodation became participation. Participation divided the heart of the king. A kingdom can appear strongest at the very moment its foundation begins to fracture. God announced judgment. The kingdom would be torn from Solomon's house. Yet for David's sake, the division would not occur fully during Solomon's lifetime, and one tribe would remain with his dynasty in Jerusalem. Adversaries began to rise. Hadad the Edomite challenged Solomon from the south. Rezin established power in Damascus and became an enemy from the north. Within Israel, another threat appeared. Jeroboam, a capable official from the tribe of Ephraim, had been placed over forced labor. The prophet Ahijah met him on the road wearing a new garment. Ahijah tore the garment into 12 pieces and told Jeroboam to take 10. The kingdom would be divided. 10 tribes would be given to Jeroboam because Solomon had turned toward other gods. One portion would remain under David's house because of God's covenant and Jerusalem's chosen role. The judgment was real, but it was not the complete destruction of the promise. Jeroboam was also given a conditional opportunity. If he listened to God and walked faithfully, his house could be established. Solomon attempted to kill him. Jeroboam fled to Egypt and remained there until Solomon's death. After 40 years of rule, Solomon died and was buried in Jerusalem. His son Rehoboam inherited the throne. The kingdom looked united on the day Solomon died, but the people were carrying the cost of his greatness. Rehoboam traveled to Shechem, where the northern tribes gathered to crown him. Jeroboam returned from Egypt and joined the people in presenting a request. "Your father made our yoke heavy. Now lighten the hard service and the heavy yoke he placed upon us, and we will serve you." The request was not a rejection of monarchy. The people were offering loyalty in exchange for relief. Rehoboam asked for 3 days to consider. The older counselors who had served Solomon advised him to answer gently. If he became a servant to the people that day, they said, the people would remain his servants. But Rehoboam rejected their counsel. He turned to younger men who had grown up with him. They advised him to display strength and threaten even greater burdens. When the people returned, Rehoboam answered harshly, "My father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke." He promised whips where Solomon had used ordinary discipline. The words exposed a ruler who understood authority as domination. The northern tribes responded with a cry of separation. "What portion do we have in David to your tents, O Israel?" The United Kingdom broke apart. Rehoboam retained Judah and Benjamin in the south, with Jerusalem as the capital. This became the kingdom of Judah, ruled by the house of David. Jeroboam became king over the northern tribes. This larger territory continued to be called Israel, with Ephraim often representing its center of power. From this point onward, the names could easily become confusing. Israel now referred primarily to the northern kingdom. Judah referred to the southern kingdom, ruled from Jerusalem. They shared ancestry, language, covenant history, and many traditions, but they would often become political rivals and even enemies. Rehoboam prepared an army to reunite the kingdom by force. But the prophet Shemaiah delivered a word from God forbidding the war. The division had occurred under judgment. The army returned home. Jeroboam now faced the challenge of ruling a kingdom without Jerusalem. The temple remained in Judah. The priests served there. The law called Israelite men to appear before the Lord at appointed festivals. Jeroboam feared that if his people continued traveling south to worship, their loyalty would return to the house of David. His political insecurity created a religious system. He made 2 golden calves. One was placed at Bethel in the south of his kingdom. The other was placed at Dan in the north. He told the people that traveling to Jerusalem was too difficult and presented these images as the gods who had brought Israel out of Egypt. The language deliberately recalled the golden calf at Sinai. Jeroboam appointed priests who were not from the tribe of Levi, established his own festival, and offered sacrifices at the altar. His goal was political stability. His method reshaped Israel's worship around royal convenience. Again and again, later kings would be measured by whether they continued in the sin of Jeroboam. A man of God from Judah came to Bethel while Jeroboam stood at the altar. He announced that a future king named Josiah would defile that false sanctuary. The prophecy named a ruler who would not appear for generations. When Jeroboam stretched out his hand and ordered the prophet seized, his hand became rigid. The altar split and ashes poured out. Jeroboam pleaded for restoration, and his hand was healed. Yet the sign did not produce lasting repentance. The kingdom's first ruler had been warned directly, but he continued on the same path. In Judah, Rehoboam also failed. idolatrous worship spread, and during his reign, Shishak, king of Egypt, invaded Jerusalem. The treasures of the temple and palace were carried away. The wealth accumulated under Solomon began leaving the city only a few years after his death. The golden shields Solomon had made were taken. Rehoboam replaced them with shields of bronze. The image captured the decline of the kingdom bronze carried in ceremony, where gold had once stood. War and hostility continued between north and south through the reigns that followed. In Judah, Abijah fought against Jeroboam. Asa later carried out significant reforms, removing idols and calling the people toward covenant loyalty. Yet even Asa relied upon political alliance when threatened, using silver and gold from the temple and palace to secure help from Damascus. Reform could be sincere without being complete. In the northern kingdom, Jeroboam's dynasty did not last. His son Nadab was assassinated by Baasha, who destroyed the remaining members of Jeroboam's house. But Baasha continued the same pattern of idolatry. His son Elah was murdered by Zimri, one of his commanders. Zimri ruled only 7 days. When the army declared Omri king, Zimri burned the royal palace around himself and died. The throne of Israel had become a place of conspiracy, assassination, and rapid change. Omri defeated his rivals and established a powerful dynasty. He purchased a hill and built Samaria, which became the northern capital. Politically, Omri strengthened Israel. International records would remember his house, but the biblical account judges him by covenant faithfulness, not political achievement. He did more evil than those before him. Then his son Ahab became king. Ahab married Jezebel, the daughter of the king of Sidon. The marriage strengthened political and economic connections with the Phoenician world. It also brought official support for the worship of Baal. Ahab built a temple and altar for Baal in Samaria. Jezebel supported hundreds of prophets connected with Baal and Asherah. Prophets of the Lord were hunted and killed. Jeroboam had corrupted worship while still claiming continuity with Israel's God. Under Ahab and Jezebel, the conflict became more open. The northern kingdom was no longer merely compromising at its borders. Royal power was now being used to establish a rival religious order. It was at this moment that a prophet appeared without introduction before the king. His name was Elijah the Tishbite. He came from Gilead, stood before Ahab, and declared that there would be neither dew nor rain except by his word. The judgment struck at the center of Baal worship. Baal was honored as a storm and fertility deity, one believed to bring rain and agricultural abundance. Elijah's announcement challenged that claim directly. The sky would close, the land would dry. The king, the queen, the prophets of Baal, and the entire nation would be forced to confront one question: who truly ruled the rain, the harvest, and Israel itself? The kingdom had been divided by human pride. Now the divided nation was about to be confronted by the word of God, prophets' idolatry, and the fall of Israel. Elijah appeared before Ahab with no army, no political office, and no visible power. He carried only a word. There would be no rain. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, the prophet vanished from the royal court. God directed Elijah east of the Jordan to the brook Cherith, where ravens brought him bread and meat. He drank from the stream while the drought tightened its grip upon the land. Eventually, the brook dried up. The prophet who had announced judgment was not protected from every consequence of that judgment. He too had to live in a land without rain. God then sent him outside Israel to Zarephath, in Sidonian territory, the homeland associated with Jezebel and the worship of Baal. There Elijah met a widow gathering sticks. She had only a handful of flour and a little oil. She intended to prepare one final meal for herself and her son before they died. Elijah asked her to make bread for him first and promised that her flour and oil would not run out until rain returned. The request demanded extraordinary trust. The widow obeyed. Day after day the flour remained and the oil continued. Then her son became ill and died. The woman cried out in grief, and Elijah carried the child to the upper room where he was staying. He prayed and stretched himself over the boy and pleaded for life to return. The child revived. Elijah brought him downstairs and placed him in his mother's arms. The God of Israel had provided food and life in the heart of Baal's territory. Meanwhile, the drought became severe in Samaria. Ahab searched desperately for grass to preserve his animals. He divided the land with Obadiah, the administrator of his palace. Obadiah secretly feared the Lord. While Jezebel was killing prophets, he had hidden 100 of them in caves and supplied them with food and water. The royal court had become dangerous, but covenant faithfulness had not vanished completely. Elijah met Obadiah and told him to announce his return to Ahab. When the king saw Elijah, he accused him of bringing trouble upon Israel. Elijah answered that the true trouble came from Ahab's abandonment of the commandments and his devotion to the Baals. The drought was not the cause of Israel's crisis. It was the exposure of it. Elijah summoned the people to the prophets of Baal and the prophets associated with Asherah to Mount Carmel. The mountain overlooked territories influenced by Phoenician religion. There, the central question would be made public. Elijah stood before the gathered nation. How long will you go limping between two different opinions? If the Lord was God, Israel must follow him. If Baal was God, they should follow Baal. The people answered nothing. 2 sacrifices were prepared. The prophets of Baal would call upon their deity, and Elijah would call upon the Lord. The God who answered by fire would be recognized as God. Baal's prophets went first. From morning until noon they cried out and danced around the altar. There was no voice. Elijah mocked the emptiness of their efforts. Perhaps Baal was thinking, traveling, sleeping, or too occupied to respond. The prophets shouted louder and cut themselves until blood flowed. Still, there was no answer, no voice, no response. No one paid attention. Then Elijah called the people near. He repaired an altar of the Lord using 12 stones, 1 for each tribe descended from Jacob. Even though the kingdom had been divided, the covenant identity of Israel had not been forgotten. Elijah arranged the sacrifice and wood. He ordered water poured over everything until the trench around the altar was filled. Then he prayed. His prayer was brief. He asked that the people know the Lord was God and that he was turning their hearts back. Fire fell. It consumed the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, the dust, and the water in the trench. The people fell upon their faces. The Lord, he is God. The prophets of Baal were seized, and judgment fell upon them. Then Elijah climbed to the summit of Carmel and prayed for rain. At first his servants saw nothing. Then, on the 7th report, a small cloud appeared over the sea, no larger than a man's hand. The sky darkened, wind rose, rain poured upon the land. Carmel appeared to be a decisive national turning point. But one dramatic victory did not transform the royal house. When Jezebel heard what had happened, she threatened Elijah's life. The prophet fled south. After standing alone before hundreds of false prophets, he collapsed under fear and exhaustion in the wilderness. He sat beneath a broom tree and asked to die. An angel gave him food and water. Elijah slept, ate, and continued toward Horeb, the mountain where the covenant had been given. There he entered a cave. God asked, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Elijah spoke of his zeal and isolation. Israel had abandoned the covenant, torn down altars, killed prophets, and now sought his life. A powerful wind tore through the mountains. But the Lord was not in the wind. An earthquake followed. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. Then came fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. Afterward came a low whisper. Elijah covered his face. God's work would not always come through public fire upon a mountain. It would also move quietly through appointed kings, a successor prophet, and thousands in Israel who had not bowed to Baal. Elijah was told to anoint Elisha as the prophet who would continue his mission. He found Elisha plowing with oxen and threw his cloak over him. Elisha left his former life and followed. Ahab's reign continued through warfare and political intrigue. When Ben-Hadad of Syria attacked Samaria with a large coalition, God gave Israel victory, despite Ahab's unfaithfulness. But Ahab spared Ben-Hadad and made a treaty with him, treating a military triumph as an opportunity for personal diplomacy rather than obedience. Then came the vineyard of Naboth. Naboth owned land beside Ahab's palace in Jezreel. The king wanted it for a vegetable garden and offered payment or another vineyard. Naboth refused because the property belonged to his ancestral inheritance. Ahab returned home resentful, lay on his bed, and refused to eat. Jezebel mocked his weakness and promised to obtain the vineyard. She arranged false witnesses who accused Naboth of cursing God and the king. Naboth was taken outside the city and stoned to death. When Jezebel informed Ahab, the king went down to take possession. Elijah met him there. The royal house had used legal language, public religion, and false testimony to murder an innocent man. The king, who should have defended covenant justice, had allowed the throne to become an instrument of theft. Elijah announced judgment upon Ahab's house. Ahab humbled himself, and the full disaster was delayed, but not canceled. Later, Ahab entered battle at Ramoth-Gilead. Before the campaign, prophets around him promised victory. Micaiah, a prophet willing to speak against the royal consensus, warned that Israel would be scattered like sheep without a shepherd. Ahab disliked him because he did not prophesy favorable things. The king disguised himself in battle, while the king of Judah wore royal clothing. But a soldier drew his bow without knowing whom he would strike. The arrow entered a gap in Ahab's armor. The king died in his chariot. Human disguise could not escape the word already spoken. Ahab's son Ahaziah succeeded him but reigned only briefly. After an injury, he sent messengers to inquire of a foreign deity. Elijah intercepted them and announced his death. Then the time came for Elijah's departure. Elisha refused to leave his master as they traveled from Gilgal to Bethel, Jericho, and finally the Jordan. Elijah struck the river with his cloak, and the waters divided. On the other side, Elijah asked what Elisha desired. Elisha requested a double portion of his spirit, not twice as much power in a simple numerical sense, but the inheritance associated with a firstborn successor. As they continued, a chariot and horses of fire appeared, and Elijah was taken up in a whirlwind. Elisha tore his clothes, picked up Elijah's fallen cloak, and returned to the Jordan. He struck the water and asked, "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" The river divided. The prophetic mission continued. Elisha's ministry combined public judgment with repeated acts of mercy. He purified water at Jericho. He helped a widow whose creditors threatened to take her sons by multiplying her small supply of oil. He promised a son to a Shunammite woman who had shown him hospitality. When that child later died, Elisha prayed and the boy returned to life. During famine, he made poisoned food safe. He fed a large group with a small amount of bread. A Syrian commander named Naaman came to him suffering from a skin disease. Naaman arrived with wealth, horses, and expectations of a dramatic ritual. Elisha did not even come outside to meet him. He sent word that Naaman should wash 7 times in the Jordan. Naaman became angry. The rivers of Damascus seemed better than Israel's muddy river. His servants persuaded him to obey. When he washed, his flesh was restored. Naaman confessed that there was no God in all the earth except the God of Israel. But Elisha's servant Gehazi secretly pursued Naaman and accepted gifts after Elisha had refused them. The disease left Naaman and came upon Gehazi. The prophetic office could not be used for private profit. Elisha also moved through scenes of war. He repeatedly warned Israel's king about Syrian movements. When the Syrian army surrounded the town of Dothan to capture him, Elisha's servant panicked. Elisha prayed that his eyes would be opened. The servant saw the mountain filled with horses and chariots of fire. The visible army was not the only power present. Elisha then led the blinded Syrians into Samaria. Instead of permitting their execution, he instructed Israel's king to feed them and send them home. At another time, Samaria was besieged so severely that famine produced horrifying desperation within the city. Elisha announced that food would become abundant by the next day. An officer mocked the promise. But during the night, the Syrian army heard what sounded like a great military force and fled, abandoning supplies. 4 men suffering from skin disease discovered the empty camp and brought the news. The starving city was fed. The officer who doubted saw the fulfillment but died in the rush at the gate. Even while miracles occurred, the northern kingdom remained politically unstable. A commander named Jehu was secretly anointed to destroy the house of Ahab. He drove furiously toward Jezreel, killed Ahab's son Joram, and confronted Jezebel. She appeared at a window and challenged him. At Jehu's command, attendants threw her down. The dynasty of Ahab ended in violence, just as Elijah had warned. Jehu also destroyed the temple of Baal and killed its worshippers. Yet he did not remove Jeroboam's calves at Bethel and Dan. He eliminated one form of idolatry while preserving another that served his kingdom. Partial reform left the central rebellion untouched. Dynasties continued to rise and fall. Kings were assassinated. Rival powers gained strength. Syria pressed Israel from the north and east. Then the Assyrian Empire began expanding across the region. Assyria was not simply another neighboring kingdom. It was an imperial war machine that used organized armies, siege technology, deportation, and terror to control conquered peoples. As Assyria's shadow lengthened, prophets warned that Israel's danger was not merely military. Amos came from Judah, but preached in the northern kingdom during a period of prosperity. The wealthy enjoyed houses of ivory, elaborate meals, and public worship. Yet the poor were being crushed, justice was sold, and religious festivals continued without righteousness. Amos announced that God did not accept songs and sacrifices separated from justice. Let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Israel believed its chosen status protected it. Amos warned that covenant privilege increased responsibility. The day of the Lord, which many expected to bring victory over enemies, could become darkness for an unrepentant nation. At Bethel, the priest Amaziah told Amos to return to Judah and stop prophesying near the king's sanctuary. Amos answered that he had not chosen the role for political gain. God had taken him from tending livestock and sent him to speak. The royal sanctuary would not silence the word of judgment. Hosea's prophetic life carried the message in deeply personal form. He married Gomer, whose unfaithfulness became a living picture of Israel's covenant betrayal. Their children received names that announced coming judgment: Jezreel, no mercy, and not my people. Yet Hosea's message did not end with rejection. God spoke of drawing his people back, healing their faithlessness, and restoring the relationship. Israel had pursued other gods as though they supplied grain, wine, oil, and security. But it was the Lord who had provided those gifts. The nation had forgotten the source of its blessing. Hosea exposed Israel's political instability as well. The kingdom turned between Assyria and Egypt, seeking security through alliances while refusing to return wholeheartedly to God. They sow the wind, Hosea declared, and they shall reap the whirlwind. The final kings of Israel ruled through conspiracy and fear. One king assassinated another. A ruler would pay tribute to Assyria, then a later ruler would attempt rebellion. Every political strategy brought only temporary relief. Menahem submitted to the Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser and collected money from wealthy Israelites to pay the tribute. Pekah later joined Syria in attempting to force Judah into an anti-Assyrian alliance. When Judah's king Ahaz refused Israel and Syria attacked him, the crisis frightened Jerusalem. The prophet Isaiah told Ahaz to trust the Lord rather than panic. He offered the king a sign, but Ahaz refused with words that sounded humble while he had already decided upon another path. Ahaz appealed directly to Assyria. He sent silver and gold from the temple and palace to Tiglath-Pileser and called himself the Assyrian king's servant. Assyria came to his aid, but the rescue carried a price. Syria fell. Large portions of northern Israel were conquered. Many people were deported. Ahaz then copied an Assyrian altar he saw in Damascus and introduced it into temple worship in Jerusalem. Judah had gained temporary military protection by placing itself beneath the empire that would soon threaten its own existence. In the northern kingdom, Hoshea became the final king. At first, he paid tribute to Assyria. Then he sought support from Egypt and stopped sending payment. The Assyrian king invaded. Samaria was surrounded. For 3 years the capital endured the siege. No Elijah called down fire to destroy the army. No political alliance opened an escape. The warnings of generations had reached their conclusion. Samaria fell. The northern kingdom of Israel ceased to exist as an independent nation. Its population was deported to regions throughout the Assyrian Empire, while other peoples were settled within its former territory. This imperial policy weakened national identity and reduced the likelihood of organized rebellion. The biblical account explains the fall not merely as the result of Assyria's strength, but as the outcome of Israel's long covenant rebellion. The people had worshipped other gods, followed the practices of surrounding nations, rejected warnings, built high places, served idols, and imitated the cultures from which they had been called to remain distinct. Prophets had risen early and spoken repeatedly. The nation did not listen. The exile did not begin when the walls of Samaria fell. It began when warning after warning was ignored. The disappearance of the northern throne should have terrified Judah. The southern kingdom had the temple Jerusalem, the priesthood, and the dynasty of David, but those gifts did not make it immune to judgment. Ahaz had filled Judah with idolatry and even practiced child sacrifice. When he died, his son Hezekiah became king. Hezekiah reversed much of his father's policy. He reopened and purified the temple, restored worship, and called the people to return to the Lord. He also destroyed high places, broke sacred pillars, and cut down objects associated with false worship. Among the things he destroyed was the bronze serpent Moses had made in the wilderness. Israelites had begun burning incense to it. A symbol once connected to healing had become an idol. Hezekiah refused to preserve it merely because it came from Israel's sacred past. Faithfulness required distinguishing between honoring what God had done and worshiping an object God never intended to become divine. Hezekiah also rebelled against Assyrian control. The decision brought the empire directly against Judah. Sennacherib, king of Assyria, invaded and captured fortified cities throughout the land. Relief carvings from Assyria would later celebrate the siege of Lachish, one of Judah's major cities. Jerusalem stood almost alone. Hezekiah initially attempted to buy peace, sending silver and even stripping gold from the temple doors. But the Assyrian demand continued. An Assyrian official came to Jerusalem and spoke loudly in the hearing of the people upon the walls. He mocked Hezekiah's confidence, ridiculed Egypt as an unreliable ally, and challenged the people's faith in God. Had any god of another nation delivered its land from Assyria, why should Jerusalem be different? The speech was designed to destroy trust before the battle began. Hezekiah tore his clothes and went into the temple. He sent messengers to Isaiah. The prophet answered that the Assyrian king would not enter Jerusalem or shoot an arrow into it. God would defend the city for his own sake and for the sake of David. Sennacherib sent a written threat. Hezekiah took the letter into the temple, spread it before the Lord, and prayed. He did not deny Assyria's victories. The empire had indeed destroyed many nations and burned their gods. But those gods were human-made objects of wood and stone. Hezekiah asked for deliverance so that the kingdoms of the earth would know that the Lord alone was God. That night disaster struck the Assyrian camp. The army withdrew. Sennacherib returned to Nineveh, where he was later killed by his own sons. Jerusalem survived. The city had stood at the edge of destruction and been spared. Hezekiah also experienced a serious illness. Isaiah told him to prepare for death, but Hezekiah prayed and his life was extended. Visitors later arrived from Babylon after hearing of his recovery. Hezekiah showed them his treasures, armory, and wealth. Isaiah asked what the visitors had seen. Everything, Hezekiah answered. The prophet then announced that a day would come when all those treasures would be carried to Babylon. Some of Hezekiah's own descendants would be taken away. The city had escaped Assyria, but Babylon had now entered the story. Hezekiah's son Manasseh became one of Judah's most destructive kings. He rebuilt high places, erected altars for Baal, practiced sorcery, and placed an idolatrous image within the temple itself. He shed much innocent blood. According to Chronicles, Manasseh was later taken captive, humbled himself, and attempted reforms after being restored. Yet the damage of his reign reached far beyond personal repentance. A nation can be forgiven and still carry consequences created by decades of corruption. Manasseh's son Amon continued in evil and was assassinated. Then Josiah became king while still a child. During repairs to the temple, the book of the law was found. When it was read before Josiah, he tore his clothes. He recognized how far Judah had departed from the covenant and feared the judgment written in the law. The prophetess Huldah confirmed that disaster would come because the nation had abandoned God. But because Josiah humbled himself, he would not see the full destruction during his lifetime. Josiah gathered the people, read the covenant aloud, and led the most extensive reforms Judah had seen. Idols were removed. False priests were deposed. The high place at Bethel, the sanctuary established by Jeroboam centuries earlier, was defiled and destroyed, fulfilling the words spoken near the beginning of the divided kingdom. Passover was celebrated with renewed seriousness. For a moment, the nation appeared to be returning, but reform from the throne could not instantly transform every heart. The judgment announced through generations of prophets had been delayed, not erased. Near the end of Josiah's reign, the political world shifted again. Assyria weakened. Egypt moved north. Babylon rose in the east. Josiah confronted Pharaoh Necho at Megiddo and was killed. The reforming king was carried back to Jerusalem and the nation mourned. Jeremiah composed laments for him. With Josiah's death, Judah lost its last strong reforming ruler. The northern kingdom was already gone. Assyria was collapsing. Egypt and Babylon were struggling for control. Jerusalem still had its walls, its temple, and a descendant of David upon the throne. But the city was entering its final years. The question was no longer whether judgment had been warned. The question was whether Judah would listen before Babylon reached the gates. Judah's final years, Jerusalem's fall, and the exile. Josiah's death at Megiddo did more than end the life of a reforming king. It exposed how vulnerable Judah had become. Assyria, once the dominant empire of the region, was collapsing. Egypt was pushing north to control the roads and territories left behind. Babylon was rising from Mesopotamia with a strength that would soon reshape the ancient world. Judah stood between these empires. Its kings still sat upon David's throne. Priests still served in Solomon's temple. Worshippers still entered Jerusalem during the festivals. But the nation's political independence was disappearing. After Josiah's death, the people placed his son Jehoahaz upon the throne. He ruled only 3 months before Pharaoh Necho removed him and carried him to Egypt. Necho then installed another of Josiah's sons, Eliakim, changing his name to Jehoiakim. The change of name was a public sign of control. Judah's king ruled, but under Egyptian authority. Jehoiakim taxed the land to pay Egypt's demands. He also built an impressive palace using forced labor, while injustice spread around him. The prophet Jeremiah confronted him. A king from David's line was supposed to defend the poor, rescue the oppressed, and judge with righteousness. Jehoiakim measured greatness through cedar walls and royal luxury. Jeremiah reminded him that Josiah had also eaten and drunk, yet he practiced justice and righteousness. True kingship was not proven by the size of a palace. It was revealed by how the king treated those without power. Jeremiah had been called as a prophet during Josiah's reign. God told him that he had been appointed before birth to speak to nations and kingdoms, to uproot and tear down, but also to build and plant. His message would dominate Judah's final decades. Jeremiah walked through the streets of Jerusalem, stood at the temple gates, confronted kings, debated false prophets, and carried warnings that few wanted to hear. The people believed the temple guaranteed their safety. They repeated, "The temple of the Lord," as though the building itself could prevent invasion. Jeremiah stood at the entrance and exposed the illusion. Would the people steal, murder, commit adultery, swear falsely, worship other gods, and then enter the temple claiming protection? The sanctuary was not a shelter for unrepentant injustice. Jeremiah reminded them of Shiloh, where the tabernacle had once stood. The ark had been captured there during Eli's time. Sacred history had not protected a corrupt community then, and the temple would not protect Jerusalem now. The people had confused God's covenant faithfulness with permission to rebel without consequence. Jeremiah warned that an enemy was coming from the north. At first, the identity of that enemy may not have been fully clear to every listener, but history soon revealed it. At Carchemish, Babylon defeated Egypt. Nebuchadnezzar became the great imperial power of the region. Judah passed from Egyptian control into Babylonian control. Jehoiakim submitted for a time, then rebelled. Jeremiah continued speaking against the king and nation. During one period, he was forbidden from entering the temple, so he dictated his messages to his scribe Baruch. Baruch read the scroll publicly. Officials heard the words and brought the message to the palace. As the scroll was read before Jehoiakim, the king cut off sections with a knife and threw them into the fire. He believed he could destroy the warning by destroying the written page. But Jeremiah dictated the words again, adding further messages of judgment. A king may burn a scroll. He cannot burn the truth that the scroll contains. Jehoiakim died as Babylonian pressure increased. His son, Jehoiakim, became king. He ruled only 3 months before Nebuchadnezzar's forces surrounded Jerusalem. This time the city surrendered. Jehoiachin, the royal household, military leaders, craftsmen, officials, and many of Jerusalem's most influential people were deported to Babylon. Treasures were removed from the temple and palace. Among the exiles was a young priest named Ezekiel. The throne of David still existed in Jerusalem, but its legitimate king was now a prisoner in a foreign empire. Nebuchadnezzar placed Jehoiachin's uncle Mattaniah upon the throne and changed his name to Zedekiah. Like the renaming of Jehoiakim, the act demonstrated Babylon's authority. Zedekiah would be Judah's final king. He was caught between competing voices. Officials urged resistance. False prophets promised rapid restoration. Egypt offered the possibility of military support. Jeremiah insisted that Babylon's rise was not a problem Judah could solve through another political alliance. The invasion had become an instrument of judgment. This message made Jeremiah appear disloyal. He announced that those who surrendered to Babylon would live, while those who remained in the city would face sword famine and disease. To many leaders, such words sounded like treason. But Jeremiah was not celebrating Babylon. He was telling Judah that the time for avoiding judgment had passed. The nation could no longer behave as though one more strategy would erase generations of rebellion. Meanwhile, the exiles in Babylon hoped their displacement would be brief. A prophet named Hananiah publicly declared that Babylon's yoke would soon be broken. He took the wooden yoke Jeremiah had been wearing as a prophetic sign and broke it before the people. Hananiah promised that the temple vessels and the exiled king would return within 2 years. It was the message everyone wanted. Jeremiah initially answered that he wished it could be true, but a prophecy of peace had to be confirmed by its fulfillment, especially when generations of covenant warning pointed in the opposite direction. Jeremiah returned with another message. Hananiah had broken a wooden yoke, but an iron yoke would replace it. The false promise of immediate escape could not remove the reality of judgment. Jeremiah wrote to the exiles in Babylon. He told them to build houses, plant gardens, marry, raise families, and seek the welfare of the cities where they had been taken. The exile would not end immediately. They must learn to live faithfully in a land they had not chosen. Yet Jeremiah also declared that exile would not last forever. God would visit his people and bring them back. The same prophet who announced destruction also carried words of future restoration. He spoke of a new covenant, not merely words written upon stone, but God's law written upon the heart. He envisioned forgiveness, renewed relationship, and a people who would truly know the Lord. The promise did not deny the coming disaster. It looked beyond it. In Babylon, Ezekiel received his own prophetic calling beside the Kibar River. He saw a storm, living creatures, wheels within wheels, and a throne above, an expanse. The imagery was overwhelming, but its central meaning was clear. The glory of God had not been left behind in Jerusalem. The Lord could reveal himself in Babylon. For exiles who believed that distance from the temple meant distance from God, Ezekiel's vision transformed their understanding. The God of Israel was not a local deity defeated when his people lost a war. His throne was mobile. His authority reached across empires. Ezekiel was appointed as a watchman. He was responsible to warn the people, whether they listened or not. Through symbolic actions, visions, and spoken messages, he portrayed the coming siege of Jerusalem. He described the city's idolatry, corruption, and violence. In one vision, Ezekiel saw abominations being practiced within the temple itself. He then witnessed the glory of the Lord gradually departing from the sanctuary. The movement was slow and solemn. The glory lifted from the inner place, moved toward the threshold, and finally departed from the city. The temple would fall not because Babylon had defeated God within his own house. It would fall after the holy presence had withdrawn from a sanctuary corrupted by persistent rebellion. Back in Judah, Zedekiah finally rebelled against Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar returned. The Babylonian army surrounded Jerusalem and built siege works against it. The final crisis began. Inside the city, food became scarce. Disease spread. Fear increased. Political factions searched for hope in Egypt. An Egyptian army moved toward Judah, and the Babylonians temporarily lifted the siege to confront it. Jerusalem may have believed deliverance had come. Jeremiah warned that the relief would not last. Even if Judah somehow defeated most of the Babylonian force, the wounded survivors would rise and burn the city. The judgment was no longer avoidable through military calculation. During the interruption in the siege, Jeremiah attempted to leave Jerusalem for the territory of Benjamin. He was accused of deserting to the Babylonians, beaten and imprisoned. Zedekiah secretly consulted him. The king wanted a favorable word, but lacked the courage to act upon the truth he received. Jeremiah again told him that he would be handed over to Babylon. Officials later accused Jeremiah of weakening the soldiers and demanded his death. He was lowered into a cistern where he sank into mud. A official named Ebed-Melech intervened. With the king's permission, he pulled Jeremiah from the pit using ropes and old cloths placed beneath the prophet's arms. In the final days of Judah, when many leaders rejected the word of God, a foreign servant acted with courage and mercy. Jeremiah was brought again before Zedekiah. He urged the king to surrender. If he did, his life and the city could be spared from the worst destruction. Zedekiah admitted his fear. He worried about how others would treat him. The last king of Judah was not without warnings. He was without the courage to obey them. The siege resumed. Month after month, Jerusalem weakened. The city that David had captured, Solomon had adorned, Hezekiah had defended, and Josiah had reformed, was now trapped behind its own walls. The people who once sang of Zion as secure watched hunger consume the city. Lamentations later gave poetic voice to the grief. The roads to Zion mourned. The city once full of people sat desolate. Children cried for food. Priests and elders suffered. The suffering was not described as a distant political statistic. It was experienced in streets, homes, bodies, and families. At last, the Babylonians broke through the wall. The defenders could no longer hold the city. Zedekiah and his soldiers attempted to escape by night through a gate near the king's garden. They fled toward the Jordan Valley, but Babylonian forces overtook them near Jericho. Zedekiah was brought before Nebuchadnezzar at Riblah. There, the final king of Judah watched his sons being killed. Then his eyes were put out. The last image Zedekiah ever saw was the destruction of his own dynasty. He was bound in bronze chains and taken to Babylon. The Davidic throne in Jerusalem stood empty. Babylonian forces entered the city. The temple of the Lord was burned. The royal palace was burned. The great houses of Jerusalem were burned. The walls were broken down. Bronze pillars, temple furnishings, and sacred vessels were carried away. Priests and officials were executed. More people were deported. The structure Solomon had built, the house once filled with glory, became a ruin. The city had believed that the temple made it untouchable. Now smoke rose from the sanctuary. For generations, Israel had been warned that covenant rebellion could lead to removal from the land. Moses had spoken of it before the Jordan was crossed. Prophets had repeated it under kings and dynasties. Israel's northern kingdom had already fallen to Assyria. Judah had seen the example and continued along the same road. The exile was not a sudden change in God's character. It was the end of a long history of ignored warning. Yet even in the destruction, Jeremiah performed an action of hope. While Jerusalem was under threat, he purchased a field in Anathoth from a relative. The legal documents were sealed and preserved. Buying land while an enemy surrounded the nation appeared foolish, but the act declared that houses, fields, and vineyards would one day again be bought in the land. Judgment was coming. Restoration was still possible beyond it. After Jerusalem fell, Babylon appointed Gedaliah as governor over the poor who remained in Judah. He established his administration at Mizpah and encouraged the survivors to serve Babylon and cultivate the land. For a brief moment, life seemed capable of continuing. Then Ishmael, a man of royal blood, assassinated Gedaliah. Fear spread among the remnant. They believed Babylon would retaliate. The leaders asked Jeremiah to seek God's guidance and promised to obey whatever answer came. The message was clear. Remain in Judah, do not flee to Egypt. God would preserve them if they stayed. But when the answer contradicted their plans, they accused Jeremiah of lying. They fled south and forced Jeremiah and Baruch to go with them. The people rescued from Egypt in the days of Moses now returned there in fear. The movement reversed the Exodus. Israel's story had traveled from slavery to freedom, from wilderness to land, from tribes to kingdom, from tabernacle to temple. Now the kingdom was gone. The temple was ashes. The people were scattered between Babylon, the devastated land, and Egypt. The story appeared to have moved backward. But exile also forced questions that prosperity had allowed Israel to avoid. Could the people worship without the temple? Could they remain faithful without a king? Did the covenant continue outside the land? Had the promises to Abraham and David failed? The prophets answered carefully. The judgment was real. The people could not return to normal life as though nothing had happened. But destruction was not the same as abandonment. Ezekiel announced that every person was responsible to turn from sin. The exiles could not blame the failures of their ancestors while refusing repentance themselves. He also spoke of a new shepherd, because Israel's leaders had fed themselves instead of the flock. God would seek the scattered sheep, bind up the injured, and judge between them. Ezekiel described a future ruler from the line of David in the language of one shepherd over a restored people. Then he was carried in a vision to a valley filled with dry bones. The bones were not recently dead. They were scattered, exposed, and completely dry. God asked, "Son of man, can these bones live?" Ezekiel answered that God alone knew. He was told to prophesy. The bones came together, sinews and flesh covered them, but there was no breath. Then Ezekiel called for breath to enter them. They stood upon their feet like a vast army. The vision represented the house of Israel. The people were saying that their bones were dry, their hope was lost, and they had been cut off. God promised to open their graves, restore them, and place His Spirit within them. Exile felt like death. Restoration would require something like resurrection. Ezekiel also spoke of cleansing a new heart and a new spirit. The heart of stone would be removed and replaced with a heart capable of responding to God. The nation's deepest problem had never been merely Egypt, Canaanite armies, Philistines, Assyria, or Babylon. It was the human heart that repeatedly turned from the covenant. A lasting restoration would require inward transformation. The book of Kings ends not with Jerusalem's rebuilding, but with a small event in Babylon. Years after Jehoiachin had been taken captive, a new Babylonian king released him from prison. Jehoiachin was given a place of honor and allowed to eat regularly at the royal table. He remained in exile. He did not return to rule Jerusalem. But the descendant of David had not been erased. The final image is not a restored throne. It is a preserved line. From creation to exile, the Old Testament story reveals one continuous pattern. God creates and gives. Humanity receives and rebels. Judgment follows. Yet mercy preserves a future. Adam and Eve lost Eden, but life continued outside the garden. The flood judged a violent world, but Noah was preserved. Babel scattered the nations, but Abraham was called to become a blessing to them. Joseph was sold, but his suffering became the means of preserving his family. Israel was enslaved, but God brought the people through the sea. The wilderness generation failed, but their children entered the land. The judges could not create lasting faithfulness, but a royal line emerged through Ruth and David. Saul lost the throne, but the kingdom was established under David. David sinned grievously, yet the covenant promise continued beyond him. Solomon built the temple, and later compromised the kingdom. The nation divided, Israel fell. Judah survived for a time, then repeated the same rebellion. At last, Jerusalem burned. The exile was a historical catastrophe, a covenant judgment, and a spiritual crisis. But it was not the destruction of God's ability to keep His word. The people had lost the land, yet the promise to Abraham remained. The throne was empty, yet the promise to David remained. The temple was destroyed, yet the presence of God had appeared among the exiles. The covenant had been broken, yet prophets spoke of a new covenant. The nation seemed dead, yet Ezekiel saw dry bones live. The Old Testament story from creation to exile does not present human beings gradually becoming righteous enough to repair the world. It shows the opposite. Knowledge law land, kingship, priesthood, and temple were all genuine gifts, but none could by itself remove the rebellion within the human heart. Scripture does not hide the weakness of its heroes, because the story was never built upon human perfection. Abraham feared, Jacob deceived, Moses failed, Israel rebelled, Saul disobeyed, David abused power, Solomon compromised, kings ignored prophets, priests corrupted worship, the people trusted idols, armies, wealth, alliances, and sacred buildings. Still, the promise survived those who repeatedly failed to carry it faithfully. The walls fell, the temple burned, the throne stood empty, but the promise had not ended. If this complete journey has helped you understand how the Old Testament fits together, share in the comments which book, king, prophet, or biblical era should receive the next full documentary. Subscribe to continue exploring Scripture as one connected story, and follow the next chapter to discover how exile eventually gave way to return, rebuilding, and a renewed hope for the future. The kingdom fell, but the promise continued.